Beneath the crimson sky of Alexandria, the palace slept uneasily. Outside, the Nile carried the scent of salt and lotus, whispering to the marble walls like a confidant bearing bad news. Inside, torches hissed in the humid air, casting liquid shadows across silk curtains and golden pillars. The queen was dying, or so the story would claim. Yet in that moment, Cleopatra VII Philopator, last sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was not merely confronting death. She was performing it. Every breath, every gesture was deliberate, precise, choreographed for the eyes that would one day rewrite her tale. History tells us she chose the ASP, that infamous serpent, to end her life in a single bite. But history also lies when power demands it. What if the snake was a symbol, not a weapon? What if Cleopatra's final act was not surrender, but strategy? Her last masterful move in a game that had already outlived her empire. The Roman conquerors wanted a spectacle. The wicked queen defeated, her seductive magic broken, her death a warning to those who might challenge Rome's order. They expected tragedy. Cleopatra gave them theater. The chamber where she lay was silent except for the flutter of linen and the distant murmur of waves against stone. Outside, Octavian's troops waited for confirmation. The queen was gone. Egypt was theirs. Yet within the chamber, something else was unfolding, a different kind of victory, one that would take centuries to understand. For Cleopatra, born of gods and philosophers, daughter of two civilizations, had always understood that power was never simply armies and gold. Power was memory, and memory, if tended carefully, could outlive empires. In that dim light, she was neither defeated nor afraid. The legends say she adorned herself as Isis, goddess of resurrection and magic, before her final moments. Her servants found her draped in white linen, jewels glinting like fragments of starlight. Whether the serpent was real or imagined, the transformation was complete. Cleopatra had become myth. She had turned her life and death into a mirror that would reflect across ages, captivating every mind that tried to see her clearly. But how did we arrive at this moment? How did the young woman who once charmed scholars, generals, and poets become the specter that haunted Rome's conscience for generations? Was she truly the manipulative enchantress of Roman propaganda, or a visionary monarch crushed beneath the arrogance of empire? The answers do not lie in the marble ruins or the fading papyrus scrolls. They lie in the spaces between, the silences where history hesitates to speak. As her body was prepared for burial, rumors rippled through the city. Some claimed she had poisoned herself. Others whispered she had escaped, vanishing into the deserts of Upper Egypt with her treasures and loyal priests. Octavian's men sealed the palace and silenced the servants, but the whispers spread anyway, across the docks, through the markets, along the Nile. The queen had died, but her story was already beginning to move beyond her captor's control. What the Romans feared most was not Cleopatra's armies or her alliances. It was her narrative. They had spent years painting her as a sorceress who ensnared the noblest men of Rome, a barbarian queen whose ambition threatened civilization itself. Yet standing before her lifeless form, Octavian understood something dreadful. She had beaten him in the only arena that mattered, the theater of eternity. Rome could conquer Egypt, but it could not conquer her legend. Centuries later, poets would resurrect her in verses of gold and sorrow. Painters would capture her eyes, neither pleading nor defeated but knowing. Even her enemies, in trying to destroy her image, ensured it would never fade. The seductress, the scholar, the goddess, the identities they used to confine her became the very keys to her immortality. Every retelling, every distortion, kept her alive. And so, the night of Cleopatra's death was not the end of a reign but the birth of a riddle. Beneath the marble tombs and political records, beneath the noise of conquest and empire, lies a truth we have barely begun to uncover. What if Cleopatra's true power was never her throne or her lovers, but her mastery of the unseen, the art of shaping how she would be remembered? The torches in the palace burned low. The soldiers outside shifted uneasily, waiting for orders. Somewhere along the river, fishermen claimed to have seen a strange procession of lights moving silently across the water. priests carrying a veiled figure toward the horizon. In the centuries that followed, countless expeditions would search for her tomb, her treasures, her final resting place. None have found them. Perhaps that was her final command, that the world should forever seek her, never find her, and thus never forget. Cleopatra's death, then, was not merely a closing act. It was the opening of a mystery that has endured for more than 2 millennia. Every empire that rose after Rome would find her reflection somewhere within its stories. Every age that sought to define power, beauty, or knowledge would invoke her name. She became a cipher through which humanity examined its own obsession with influence and immortality. As dawn broke over Alexandria that morning, the sun turned the Nile into a ribbon of molten gold. The city stirred beneath the watchful eyes of statues and broken columns. Somewhere, perhaps in the very moment Octavian announced her death to the world, a new idea took root, an idea that history could never completely control its subjects. Cleopatra had crossed the threshold from ruler to myth, from flesh to symbol. And so begins our journey, not into the ruins of a vanished kingdom, but into the labyrinth of her legacy. What truth lies buried beneath the Roman lies, beneath the centuries of art and invention? What secret was so powerful it had to be buried with her name? Perhaps, in uncovering her hidden influence, we will not only rediscover the queen who defied an empire, but also the woman who learned how to outlive time itself. The story that survives of Cleopatra is one of poison and passion, of a queen whose beauty undid great men. But that story was never hers, it was Rome's. The image of the serpent, the silken robes, the fatal kiss of death, all were painted by the victors, written not in truth but in vengeance. To the Romans, she was not a monarch but a mirror reflecting their own fears. That intellect, allure, and ambition might dwell in the body of a woman. So they turned her into a warning, a mirage of the serpent, seductive, treacherous, and doomed. But beneath that mirage lies another woman, one whose power came not from seduction, but from the mastery of perception. When Octavian, soon to be Augustus, marched into Egypt, he brought more than soldiers. He brought writers, chroniclers who would immortalize his victory by shaping Cleopatra into the perfect enemy. In their hands, she became a spell, a story crafted to ensure no one would mourn her. Cassius Dio called her a woman of infinite wiles. Plutarch, centuries later, claimed her beauty was not remarkable, but her charm irresistible. It was a clever trick. Make her irresistible, then condemn her for it. She became the embodiment of temptation, a creature whose existence justified her destruction. But there are cracks in this Roman illusion, fissures through which truth still glimmers. Fragments of Egyptian inscriptions, coins, and papyri tell a different story. One of a ruler fluent in over 9 languages, a queen who spoke to her people without translators, who studied medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. This was not the profile of a temptress. It was the portrait of a strategist. Cleopatra understood something few others did. That power, like beauty, depends on what people believe they see. Her reign began in chaos. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had left Egypt a fractured kingdom and a Roman dependency. When he died, Cleopatra ascended the throne beside her brother, Ptolemy XIII, a child under the influence of corrupt advisors. Within a year, the young queen was exiled, driven from her own capital by political intrigue. Most rulers would have fled or fallen. Cleopatra waited. She studied her enemies, their weaknesses, their ambitions. And when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey, she saw her opening. The famous image of her arrival, smuggled into the royal palace rolled up in a carpet, has become legend, but even that scene was twisted by Roman chroniclers into farce. What they missed or refused to see was that this was a calculated gesture of theater and intellect. Cleopatra understood the Roman mind. She understood that Caesar, a man of ego and destiny, would respond not to submission but to boldness. When she unrolled before him, disheveled yet regal, she was declaring not helplessness, but equality. The moment was not seduction, it was diplomacy performed as art. That meeting reshaped the course of history. Caesar saw in her a reflection of his own ambition, a ruler who believed herself destined to unite civilizations. Together, they envisioned a restoration of Egyptian greatness under the aegis of Rome's protection. Yet even then, the Roman Senate whispered that Cleopatra had bewitched him. The idea of a woman influencing their most powerful general terrified them. She was no longer just a queen. She was an infection of the mind, a living challenge to Rome's control over its own heroes. After Caesar's death, the smear campaign intensified. Roman poets and historians sharpened her image into something monstrous. An exotic temptress, a foreign witch. The asp, her chosen weapon, was no longer merely a symbol of Egyptian divinity but of deceit. To them, she was not Isis reborn but sin incarnate. Octavian's victory required more than military conquest. It required moral justification. By making Cleopatra the villain, he turned himself into the savior of Rome. Yet the brilliance of Cleopatra's legacy lies in how she used their propaganda against them. Every accusation they hurled, every portrait of her as a sorceress or a goddess, only deepened her legend. The serpent they painted around her became a halo. The more they demonized her, the more immortal she became. Rome could destroy her body, but not the story she had already begun to write in the minds of her people. The serpent itself, long before Rome, was a symbol of rebirth in Egyptian tradition. It encircled the sun in the eternal dance of creation. To call Cleopatra's death the bite of an asp was perhaps the most profound irony of all. In dying by the serpent, she was reborn through it, transformed from ruler to eternal emblem. The Romans saw tragedy. Egypt saw transfiguration. As centuries passed, the mirage of Cleopatra continued to shift. Medieval scribes called her a sinner. Renaissance artists painted her as beauty incarnate. Enlightenment scholars made her a symbol of intellect subdued by desire. Each age projected its own anxieties onto her image. Yet through all these distortions, one truth endured. The Romans could never quite erase her. Even in their vilest depictions, they spoke of her with fascination, as though some part of them knew she had transcended their hatred. In that way, Cleopatra achieved the impossible. She turned propaganda into immortality. She became the most famous woman in ancient history precisely because her enemies tried to destroy her memory. Her myth was their masterpiece, but her genius was making it hers. What they called deceit was strategy. What they named seduction was persuasion. What they portrayed as ruin was, in truth, preservation. When we strip away the lies and the theater, what remains is not a temptress, but a tactician, a woman who understood the geometry of perception. She ruled a dying kingdom not through armies or treasure, but through intellect and identity. And though the world remembers her for her death, her greatest triumph was survival. Survival in the form of story. The mirage of the serpent endures because it was never meant to vanish. It was designed, perhaps by Cleopatra herself, to guard the secret of her true self. That power is not what one holds, but what one leaves behind in the minds of others. Rome's queen of sin became humanity's queen of memory. The venom they gave her became her ink. And so, as the centuries rolled forward and empires fell, the image of Cleopatra persisted, flickering like a candle in the long corridor of time. Was she real or imagined? Mortal or divine? The answer lies somewhere between shadow and light, between the lie Rome told and the truth she planted within it. That is the mirage we chase still, every time we speak her name. In the beginning, Cleopatra was not a queen, not yet a legend, but a child born into contradiction. She entered the world in 69 BCE, in the shimmering heart of Alexandria, a city unlike any other on earth. Marble columns rose beside Egyptian obelisks. Greek philosophers debated beside priests of Isis. The air itself seemed to hum with the mingling of two civilizations. Cleopatra VII Philopator, daughter of Pharaoh Ptolemy XII Auletes, was born between worlds. Her lineage was Macedonian Greek, descended from the general who had followed Alexander the Great into Egypt 3 centuries before. Yet her cradle was carved with hieroglyphs, her lullabies sung in the language of the Nile. She was, from the very start, both foreign and native, an heir to 2 empires, belonging wholly to neither. The Ptolemies who ruled before her had never truly become Egyptian. They built temples to the old gods, yes, but they spoke Greek, lived by Greek customs, and ruled their kingdom as conquerors rather than kin. Cleopatra was different. Perhaps she sensed, even as a child, that her dynasty could not endure without becoming part of the land it claimed to rule. She learned the tongue of her people, the first of her family to do so. By adulthood, she spoke 9 languages fluently: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Median, Parthian, Syriac, and others lost to history. Where other monarchs relied on interpreters, Cleopatra spoke directly to her subjects, to envoys, to scholars, to enemies. It was a subtle kind of power, but one that made her seem less a foreign queen and more a living bridge between worlds. Her education was relentless. The Royal Library of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the world, was her classroom. She studied philosophy with Greek scholars, mathematics with Egyptian priests, medicine from ancient papyri that recorded the secrets of the body and the stars. Astronomy fascinated her most. She learned the rhythms of the heavens, the slow breathing of the planets, and the sacred geometry that linked gods to mortals. For her, knowledge was not merely a tool of rule, it was a form of devotion. In the old religion, wisdom itself was divine, and to learn was to ascend closer to godhood. But Alexandria was not paradise. Beneath its beauty, the city simmered with unrest. Her father's reign had been unstable, his love for music and excess earning him the mocking title Elites, the flute player. He had nearly bankrupted the kingdom, borrowing heavily from Roman financiers to keep his throne. The cost of his alliances was Egypt's sovereignty. By the time Cleopatra was a teenager, the Roman eagle already cast its shadow over the Nile. Senators in distant marble halls in Rome debated Egypt's debts as though they were discussing the fate of a market, not a nation. Cleopatra grew up knowing that her crown, her city, even her life, would depend on navigating the moods of men who had never seen the desert's sunrise. The palace itself was a world of intrigue. Her siblings were not merely family, they were rivals. Ptolemy XIII, the brother she would later be forced to marry, was manipulated by courtiers hungry for power. Her sisters, Berenice and Arsinoe, each in their time sought the throne. In that crucible of betrayal, Cleopatra learned the art of survival. She mastered silence before speech, observation before action. When her father was briefly overthrown, she watched him flee to Rome for help, returning with Roman legions that spilled Egyptian blood to restore him. From this, Cleopatra absorbed a bitter truth. Rome could be friend or master, but never equal. When her father died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra ascended the throne at 18, co-ruler with her younger brother. The kingdom she inherited was fractured, its economy drained, its borders weak, its loyalties divided between Rome and the old gods. But Cleopatra did not rule as a frightened child. She walked into the audience hall with calm eyes and a voice trained in command. She reinstated the priests of Isis, reopened trade routes, and personally inspected Nile flood records to manage famine relief. Even in her youth, she grasped that the loyalty of the people would be her truest defense. To the priests, she became a living Horus in female form, the earthly vessel of divine order. To the scholars, she was a philosopher queen, the inheritor of Hellenistic intellect. To the merchants, she was stability reborn. Her charisma was not of beauty alone. It was of competence, of precision, of presence. Contemporary accounts say she had a voice like music, a mind that could unravel arguments as swiftly as she could charm an adversary. Yet behind her intelligence lay loneliness. To rule Egypt was to stand between two collapsing worlds. The old gods of the Nile were fading, the Greek mind turning skeptical, and the Roman machine growing unstoppable. Cleopatra's reign was an act of defiance against inevitability, a belief that a single mind could harmonize contradictions into order. She saw herself as Isis reborn, yes, but also as the student of Plato and the heir of Alexander. Hers was not a delusion of grandeur, but a vision of unity, a dream of blending Greek rationalism with Egyptian spirituality, East with West, heaven with earth. It is easy to forget that she was once simply a young woman walking the marbled corridors of the palace, staring out at the endless blue of the sea, wondering whether her name would vanish like those before her. Perhaps that fear, the fear of being forgotten, was what drove her to cultivate not just authority but legacy. She built monuments bearing inscriptions that paired hieroglyphs with Greek verse, ensuring that future ages, no matter their language, would read her name. By the time she reached her mid-20s, Cleopatra had already faced exile, betrayal, famine, and invasion. She had learned to navigate diplomacy with Rome, to appease priests and generals alike, to mask her intelligence behind grace. Every rumor about her, every story of charm and cunning, was rooted in the reality of a woman forced to outthink everyone around her to survive. Her dual identity, Greek and Egyptian, was not a weakness. It was her secret weapon. She could host a symposium with philosophers one evening and conduct a ritual at the temple of Isis the next. She could speak of Aristotle's logic in Greek and invoke Thoth's wisdom in Egyptian. In her two ancient traditions, reason and reverence, met without contradiction. That duality made her dangerous in the eyes of Rome. To them, she was an enigma, a queen who could not be dismissed as barbarian, nor controlled as client. She was both familiar and foreign, rational yet mystical, woman yet sovereign. That combination unsettled their order. It challenged their certainty that the world belonged to them. And so, from her earliest years, Cleopatra lived not only as a ruler but as a symbol of resistance, a living contradiction the world could neither fully embrace nor destroy. The daughter of two worlds, she would soon learn that her greatest power lay in that very in-between space. For when empires clashed, it was often the bridge between them, not the walls, that determined the future. The young queen, standing at the edge of her balcony overlooking the shining harbor of Alexandria, could not yet know how her choices would echo through millennia. But perhaps she sensed it, the hum of destiny in the wind off the sea, the weight of two civilizations balanced upon her shoulders. She had been born between worlds, and she would spend her life trying to bind them together. In doing so, she would become something neither Greek nor Egyptian, neither conqueror nor conquered. She would become eternal. The city of Alexandria was Cleopatra's crown, and the Nile was its living vein. To understand her reign, one must first understand this city, her stage, her fortress, and her reflection. Founded by Alexander the Great, Alexandria was a dream of marble and intellect, a place where East met West in restless harmony. Its harbor, vast and glittering, received ships from every corner of the known world. Spice traders from Arabia, silk merchants from India, philosophers from Athens, and priests from Thebes. At night, the light from the great Pharos lighthouse reached 40 miles into the sea, guiding travelers to the city of kings and scholars. It was here that Cleopatra's genius shone brightest, not only as a monarch but as an architect of civilization. She understood that empires do not survive by force alone. They endure through story, through prosperity, through the illusion of eternity. Alexandria was more than her capital. It was her instrument of persuasion. Every colonnade and garden, every temple and theater, was designed to reflect her vision of harmony between the Greek and Egyptian worlds. She restored the temples her ancestors had neglected, funding the priests of ancient gods while patronizing Greek mathematicians and astronomers. The city became her living philosophy, reason and faith intertwined like twin serpents. The Nile itself was her heartbeat. Cleopatra knew that the river dictated Egypt's fate. When its floods were generous, the people thrived. When they failed, famine followed. But unlike the kings before her who left these rhythms to chance, she studied them. Records show she commissioned detailed surveys of the river's behavior, correlating it with lunar cycles and winds. It was said that she could predict the flooding of the Nile as if she spoke directly with its spirit. By mastering the river, she became more than queen. She became the mediator between heaven and earth, between the gods' will and the people's survival. Her reign began with famine, yet she turned disaster into loyalty. She ordered grain from distant provinces, opened royal granaries to the poor, and personally oversaw distributions in Alexandria's marketplaces. To a people weary of corruption, her presence was both shocking and divine. A monarch who walked among them, who listened, who spoke their tongue. In Egyptian art, she was depicted offering grain to Isis and Osiris, a symbol not only of piety but of partnership with her people. In Greek inscriptions, she was hailed as Philopatris, the one who loves her homeland. This rare dual devotion made her adored and feared in equal measure. But Alexandria was also a city of spies. Every corridor whispered. Every envoy carried more than gifts. The Roman Republic, though distant, kept constant watch. Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, each had interests in Egypt's wealth, its grain, and its gold. Cleopatra's court was a maze of loyalties. Greek philosophers advising her on diplomacy, Egyptian priests watching for signs of divine favor, Roman merchants scheming in the port taverns. Yet she navigated them all with uncanny precision. Her secret was simple. She never appeared predictable. One day she was philosopher queen, the next divine priestess, the next diplomat of Rome. Each mask was true, yet none complete. At the heart of her power stood the palace complex, a labyrinth of marble halls overlooking the harbor. Within its walls were gardens of papyrus and lotus, pools lined with mosaics, and chambers filled with scrolls copied from the Library of Alexandria. Here Cleopatra hosted scholars, debating mathematics and metaphysics deep into the night. She surrounded herself not with flatterers but with thinkers. Her favorite scholar, a philosopher named Dion, once wrote that the queen argued as one possessed by the spirit of the muses. To her, knowledge was not separate from rulership. It was its purest form. The library itself, though already diminished by previous fires, remained the beating mind of the city. Thousands of scrolls lined its shelves. Histories, medical treatises, hymns, and secrets from civilizations long gone. Cleopatra funded new expeditions to collect lost works. Some legends claim she personally oversaw translations from Hebrew and Persian texts into Greek, ensuring Alexandria remained the intellectual heart of the world. In her eyes, preserving wisdom was an act of divine stewardship, perhaps her truest devotion. Yet beneath this golden surface, danger grew. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, influenced by corrupt advisors, grew resentful of her authority. The young king's supporters whispered that Cleopatra sought to rule alone, to discard the Ptolemaic tradition of dual sovereignty. Their murmurs swelled into rebellion. By the third year of her reign, she was forced to flee the capital, taking refuge in the deserts of Upper Egypt. There, among priests and nomads, she learned another lesson, the power of myth. Even in exile, she remained a presence. Statues of her as Isis stood in temples across the land. Offerings were still made in her name, and rumors spread that she communed with the gods for Egypt's deliverance. When she returned to Alexandria with a small army, she did not just reclaim her throne. She reclaimed her narrative. She understood that rulers might lose armies but never their symbols. Cleopatra's rule after her return was one of restoration. She reformed tax systems, reduced the power of corrupt Greek elites, and established trade treaties reaching as far as Nubia and India. Alexandria became the world's richest city once more. The docks overflowed with spices, ivory, and scrolls. Its air smelled of cedar and cinnamon. Its streets rang with dozens of languages. She had turned her capital into a mirror of herself. Cosmopolitan, brilliant, unpredictable. And yet, even as she built, she could feel the breath of Rome at her back. The Republic was fracturing. Civil war brewed between Pompey and Caesar, and Egypt's fate would soon hinge on their struggle. Cleopatra watched carefully, calculating which alliance might preserve her throne and her people. She was a master of patience, knowing that empires rise and fall not by might alone, but by timing. To the outside world, Alexandria was a jewel. To Cleopatra, it was a chessboard. Each district, each festival, each decree was a move, designed to stabilize her rule and disguise her vulnerabilities. Her understanding of human psychology was extraordinary. She knew when to dazzle and when to disappear, when to rule as a goddess and when to kneel as a servant. Power, she believed, was not about force but about rhythm, knowing when to breathe, when to act, when to let others underestimate you. As the sun set each evening over the harbor, the queen would walk the palace balcony, her gaze fixed on the lighthouse that burned against the horizon. Its flame was eternal, a promise that no darkness could last forever. Perhaps she saw herself in that light, a beacon for a civilization on the edge of dusk. She ruled not through conquest but through vision, holding together a nation that lived at the intersection of gods and men. And yet, even in her greatest triumphs, there lingered an awareness of fragility. The river could flood or fail, the people could love or turn, the Romans could arrive at any moment. Still, Cleopatra moved through her world with the serenity of someone who understood that power was temporary, but influence, true influence, was not. She was the Nile personified, calm on the surface, unstoppable beneath. When history speaks of Cleopatra, it often speaks of lovers and wars. But the real foundation of her reign was here, in Alexandria, where intellect met divinity, and a queen became the axis of two worlds. She was not merely ruling Egypt. She was sustaining a vision of civilization itself. The Nile flowed through her hands like time, and for a brief, shining moment, she made both obey her will. He was older, hardened, and restless. A man who had conquered Gaul, defied the Senate, and marched across the Rubicon into legend. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria not as a friend, but as a storm. It was 48 BCE, and Egypt was a kingdom on the edge of ruin. The civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII had torn the country apart. The streets of Alexandria were filled with whispers and smoke. The docks, once crowded with merchants, now bristled with soldiers. When Caesar's ships appeared on the horizon, their crimson sails were not symbols of salvation but of judgment. Yet Cleopatra, ever the strategist, saw in this Roman general something no one else did. Not a threat, but an opportunity. She understood power when she saw it. Caesar was the most formidable man alive, yet his position was fragile. Rome was fractured by civil war. His enemies hunted him, and his reputation teetered between greatness and tyranny. Cleopatra knew that if she could capture his mind, she could capture Rome's attention, and perhaps its protection. But she would not beg for his favor. She would stage her re-entry into her own kingdom as only she could, through spectacle, intellect, and audacity. The story of her smuggled entrance into Caesar's chambers has become legend. Wrapped inside a rug, or perhaps a linen sack as Plutarch suggests, she was carried through the hostile city and into the Romans' presence. When the cloth unfurled and she emerged, disheveled but smiling, Caesar saw not a desperate exile but a living embodiment of courage and wit. That gesture, theatrical and calculated, shattered every expectation. In that single moment, Cleopatra claimed the upper hand, not through seduction but through genius. She transformed danger into drama, turning her survival into an act of art. What passed between them that night has been endlessly speculated, but what truly mattered was what followed. Caesar was captivated not only by her youth or beauty, but by her mind. Ancient accounts, often grudgingly written by Roman chroniclers, admit that she could debate philosophy, politics, and science as an equal. She spoke with the eloquence of a scholar and the decisiveness of a commander. To Caesar, who valued intellect above flattery, she was both challenge and mirror. Here was a ruler who understood empire, who grasped that order could be built from chaos through vision and will. Their partnership was not born of passion alone. It was an alliance of ambition. Caesar sought stability in the East. Cleopatra sought legitimacy for her throne. Together, they represented a merging of worlds. Greek intellect, Egyptian divinity, and Roman authority intertwined. Caesar reinstated her as queen, with her younger brother nominally as co-ruler, though all knew who held true power. His legions crushed her enemies, restoring her crown. In return, she offered him something far greater than wealth, the idea of an empire ruled by genius rather than birth. When the fires of Alexandria erupted during the conflict, consuming part of the great library, legend says Cleopatra stood beside Caesar as the city burned. The sight must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The flames reflected in her eyes, knowledge itself turning to smoke. Perhaps she understood then that empires, like books, could vanish in an instant, and that the only immortality worth pursuing was the kind written in memory, not stone. In the months that followed, the two ruled together from the palace. Caesar lingered in Egypt far longer than politics allowed. enchanted by the rhythm of the Nile and by Cleopatra's vision of power as poetry. They would sail the river together, observing the temples and villages, greeting crowds that hailed them as Isis and Osiris reborn. To the Egyptian people, their union was divine. To the Romans, scandalous. Caesar was already married, and rumors of his affair with a foreign queen ignited outrage in Rome. But Cleopatra was unconcerned. She was not seeking respectability, she was cultivating myth. When she bore Caesar's child, Ptolemy Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion, it was more than the birth of a son. It was the birth of an idea. That Rome and Egypt, intellect and might, could be joined in a single bloodline. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was the symbol of continuity, proof that her dynasty would not end with her. In her mind, she had bound herself to the greatest power of her time, not as a concubine, but as an equal partner in destiny. Her time with Caesar was also a lesson in empire. She watched how he governed, how he manipulated symbols and stories to legitimize his authority. She studied his methods of reform and his audacity in reshaping the republic. And perhaps she saw in him a reflection of herself, a ruler too great for the world that tried to contain him. Both were visionaries, both outcasts among their own kind, and both believed that legacy was a form of immortality. When Caesar decided to return to Rome, Cleopatra followed briefly, arriving in the city with her son and a dazzling entourage. Her presence caused a sensation. The Roman people were both enthralled and alarmed by the sight of this foreign queen riding through their streets, adorned in gold and linen, her child beside her rumored to be Caesar's heir. For a moment, it seemed as if Egypt had conquered Rome through grace alone. Statues were raised in her likeness, and her name echoed through the Senate with both awe and disdain. But Rome was a serpent's nest, and admiration easily turned to resentment. Senators whispered that Cleopatra's influence had corrupted Caesar, that he dreamed of crowning himself king with her as queen. The image of a monarchic Rome, guided by an Egyptian sorceress, was intolerable to those who clung to the republic's dying ideals. They would strike soon, and when they did, Cleopatra's carefully built dream would shatter. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE was not just the death of a man. It was the death of a possibility. Cleopatra's ally, lover, and mirror was gone, and with him, her vision of a united empire. In the chaos that followed, she fled Rome and returned to Egypt, carrying her son and the last trace of Caesar's legacy. Yet even in grief, she did not crumble. She had learned from the master of power that perception could survive even death. Caesar had taught her the art of turning defeat into narrative. When she returned to her palace, the Nile seemed quieter, its waters darker. The city awaited her next move. Her enemies believed her finished, her protection gone. But Cleopatra had already begun to weave a new strategy. She would not fade into history as a widow of Rome. She would rise again, this time not beside Caesar, but on her own terms. For though Rome had taken her ally, it had also given her a lesson in empire. And she, the daughter of two worlds, was not done rewriting destiny. The world after Caesar's death was broken, like a shattered mirror reflecting 1,000 fragments of ambition. Rome descended into chaos. Alliances dissolved, loyalties twisted, and assassins became martyrs overnight. From across the Mediterranean, Cleopatra watched the empire unravel, calculating every move, every rumor, every opportunity. She knew that the vacuum left by Caesar's death would not remain empty for long. Out of that chaos, new powers would rise, and she intended to choose the right one before they chose her. Her return to Egypt was both somber and theatrical. The queen who had once sailed beside Caesar now returned as a widow of destiny, her son Caesarion in her arms, heir not only to Egypt's throne but perhaps to Rome itself. She staged her arrival carefully. Processions along the Nile, hymns to Isis, offerings to the temples, all designed to remind her people that their queen was chosen by the gods, untouched by mortal tragedy. Yet beneath that divine mask, she grieved deeply. Caesar's absence was not just personal, it was political. The balance she had built between Rome and Egypt was gone, and the world now looked upon her with suspicion. But Cleopatra had learned the greatest lesson of power. never show desperation. Instead, she turned her sorrow into spectacle. She had monuments erected in Caesar's memory and commissioned coins bearing both their names. In doing so, she wove a new myth, that her son was the living continuation of Caesar's spirit, a divine bridge between two civilizations. This was not merely sentiment, it was strategy. For in the brutal chess game of Roman politics, legitimacy was everything. If Caesarion could be recognized, even faintly, as Caesar's heir, Egypt would hold leverage over Rome itself. Meanwhile, the Roman world fractured into three competing forces. The assassins who killed Caesar, led by Brutus and Cassius, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political heir. Cleopatra watched as these factions tore each other apart. Egypt's grain and gold made her a prize in their struggle, but she refused to be anyone's pawn. Her strategy was simple: wait for the true victor to emerge, and then make him hers, not by force, but by fascination. Mark Antony, when he summoned her, did not realize he was summoning his own fate. By then, he was one of the most powerful men in Rome, but also one of its most reckless. He controlled the eastern provinces and sought Egypt's wealth to fund his ambitions. Cleopatra, cautious but intrigued, prepared her entrance as only she could. When she sailed up the Cydnus River to meet him, her arrival became legend. Draped in gold, reclining beneath a canopy of purple silk, surrounded by servants dressed as cupids and nymphs, she transformed diplomacy into theater. Antony, a soldier used to blood and command, found himself disarmed by spectacle. That meeting changed history. Cleopatra did not plead or flatter. She challenged and charmed. She spoke to Antony as an equal, even as a superior. He was a man of war driven by impulse. She was a woman of intellect, driven by precision. Where he sought conquest, she offered empire. Their chemistry was instant, but beneath the passion was politics. Cleopatra saw in Antony a potential partner, another Caesar, but one still searching for purpose. And Antony saw in her not a queen to be conquered, but a destiny to be shared. Their union was scandalous to Rome. To the Egyptians, however, it was divine. The queen of the Nile and the general of Rome, two forces of nature intertwined. Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria, where Cleopatra introduced him to the rhythm of her court, the rituals of her people, the philosophy of her reign. The feasts, the games, the debates all served a purpose. Cleopatra was teaching him the art of ruling as she understood it, not through brute strength, but through symbolism, grace, and spectacle. In those months, Alexandria became the center of the world's imagination. The Roman chroniclers later mocked it as decadence, describing nights of wine and gold, of reckless indulgence. But the truth was subtler. Cleopatra was not corrupting Antony. She was transforming him. In her company, he began to see the possibility of something greater than Rome's endless wars. She whispered of unity between East and West, of a kingdom where intellect and faith could coexist. To Antony, weary of the Senate's intrigues and Octavian's manipulations, it was intoxicating. But passion has a cost. When Antony returned to Rome, political necessity forced him to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia. Cleopatra, outwardly composed, turned her pain into preparation. She strengthened her borders, reorganized her army, and filled her treasury with trade profits. Egypt became once again the jewel of the Mediterranean, wealthy, independent, and patient. She knew Antony would return. Men like him always did, drawn back to the source of their power, the mirror that reflected their greatness. And he did return years later in triumph and turmoil. The rivalry between him and Octavian had reached its peak, and Cleopatra once again became central to the fate of empires. When they reunited in Tarsus, it was not merely love that rekindled. It was alliance, sealed by desire and ambition alike. Cleopatra bore him children, twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Each child was a symbol, a living thread binding Egypt to Rome. Together, they envisioned a new order, a Hellenistic empire stretching from the Euphrates to the Nile, from Greece to Arabia. Antony, ever the soldier, provided might. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, provided vision. But Rome saw only betrayal. To Octavian, their union was not romance but rebellion, a threat to Roman supremacy. He began a campaign of propaganda, painting Cleopatra as a sorceress, a temptress who had ensnared Antony and turned him against his own people. The Queen of Egypt became the villain of Rome, a convenient scapegoat for its fear of the East. Cleopatra, however, did not flinch. She continued to rule with elegance and authority, ensuring Egypt remained prosperous even as Rome spiraled toward war. She saw through Octavian's tactics, yet she also knew that Antony's flaws, his pride, his impulsiveness, could be his undoing. Still, she stood by him. Perhaps she believed love could temper fate, or perhaps she simply refused to abandon the empire they had built together. Late one night, as the moon cast its reflection across the Nile, Cleopatra is said to have whispered to her closest attendant, "They will call me a harlot, but they will remember me as a queen." It was not arrogance but foresight. She knew that history would not be kind to women who wielded power in a man's world. Yet she also knew that true legacy survives beyond slander. In aligning herself with Antony, Cleopatra was gambling everything: her throne, her people, her very name, on the belief that destiny favored the bold. It was a wager few dared to make, and fewer still survived. The storm that would follow would not only decide the fate of Egypt but redefine the meaning of power itself. The world was shifting, and Cleopatra could feel the tremors long before the ground began to crack. Rome, though distant, was everywhere. Its legions, its laws, its greed. It was no longer a republic but a serpent with two heads, one belonging to Octavian, cold and cunning, the other to Mark Antony, passionate and volatile. Between them lay Egypt, the most coveted jewel of the ancient world. Cleopatra stood at the center of this widening storm, balancing love and strategy, loyalty and survival. She had chosen Antony, but she also knew that Octavian was not a man who forgave betrayal or forgot humiliation. In Alexandria, life seemed almost dreamlike, caught between luxury and impending doom. The royal court glittered brighter than ever. Feasts were held nightly, filled with music, poetry, and the scent of myrrh. Antony and Cleopatra played their roles as divine rulers, the reincarnation of Dionysus and Isis, their love elevated to myth. Yet behind the laughter, shadows gathered. The festivals were not indulgence but armor, a defense against the tension that hummed beneath every torchlit night. Cleopatra understood that image was power. As long as her people saw her radiant, unbothered, and divine, Egypt would not despair. Still, she watched Antony closely. The once sharp general had become weary, torn between two worlds, his Roman duty and his Egyptian devotion. He adored Cleopatra, but Rome's politics gnawed at his resolve. Octavian's propaganda painted him as a traitor enslaved by lust, his will bent by a foreign queen's charms. The Roman people whispered of witchcraft, of poison, of dark rituals. Cleopatra, for all her brilliance, could not silence those lies. They spread faster than truth ever could. She knew that when words become weapons, the strongest armies often fall without a fight. To fight words, she turned to spectacle. Cleopatra and Antony formed the inimitable Livers, a society dedicated to art, pleasure, and intellectual debate. Its purpose was both distraction and declaration, a show of abundance in defiance of Rome's judgment. They dined on silver boats that floated upon scented pools, dressed as gods, and quoted poetry deep into the night. Historians later mocked it as decadence, but it was a message written in gold. Egypt still lived, and its queens still ruled. Yet beneath every performance was strategy. Cleopatra was reminding her people, and Antony himself, that Egypt offered more than Rome ever could: freedom, culture, and divine legacy. But as Rome's wars deepened, Antony was drawn back into its orbit. Octavian challenged his legitimacy, questioning his loyalty and accusing him of plotting to make Alexandria the capital of a new empire. In response, Antony staged a ceremony that would shake the world. In 34 BCE, During what became known as the donations of Alexandria, he and Cleopatra appeared before the people dressed as gods, she as Isis, he as Dionysus, and declared their children rulers of vast territories. Caesarion as king of kings, Alexander Helios over Armenia, Cleopatra Selene over Cyrenaica, and Ptolemy Philadelphus over Syria. It was theater of the grandest kind, but also a declaration of independence. Antony and Cleopatra were not merely defying Rome, they were attempting to replace it. To Octavian, this was treason wrapped in silk. The Roman Senate erupted in outrage. The idea that a foreign queen could assign Roman lands to her children was intolerable. Octavian's next move was inevitable. He would wage not just a war for power, but a war for perception. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra prepared. She understood that Rome's hatred would not stop at her borders. She strengthened the fleet, stockpiled grain, trained soldiers, and filled the treasuries with gold. Every decision was precise, every alliance measured. Her mind was an empire unto itself, vast and deliberate. Antony, however, was unraveling. The charm that had once united armies began to falter under pressure. His confidence wavered, his decisions grew erratic, and Cleopatra could sense it. She loved him, perhaps more deeply than anyone else in her life, but she also saw the fatal flaw in him, the heart of a soldier who mistook passion for destiny. In the stillness of her private chambers, Cleopatra weighed her future. Could she survive without Antony? Could Egypt endure the wrath of Rome alone? Her counselors urged caution, some whispering that she should betray Antony to save herself. But she refused. Whether out of loyalty, pride, or the belief that love could defy empire, she stood by his side. It was not naivete, it was defiance. Cleopatra was not playing for safety. She was playing for immortality. Antony returned to Alexandria, and for a while they lived as though the war did not exist. Together they sailed the Nile, held court in dazzling splendor, and watched their children grow. But the river, ever the silent witness, seemed darker that year. The omens were grim. Eclipses, strange floods, dying birds over the harbor. The priests whispered that the gods themselves were uneasy. Cleopatra, steeped in both faith and reason, understood the symbolism. Nature often echoed human fate, and this was the calm before the tempest. Then came the summons from Rome. Octavian declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. It was a masterstroke of propaganda. By making her the target, he framed the conflict not as civil war but as a holy crusade against foreign corruption. Rome would not see itself as divided but as righteous. Cleopatra understood the danger immediately. She had become the face of Rome's fears, the embodiment of every anxiety about female power, Eastern influence, and the collapse of tradition. She did not cower. Instead, she ordered her ships to assemble at Actium. The Queen of Egypt would not hide behind walls. She would meet Rome on the open sea. In those final months of preparation, she was a force of precision, inspecting fleets, strategizing routes, consulting astrologers and engineers. To her soldiers, she was no longer merely a monarch. She was a commander. Antony watched her with awe, perhaps even envy. Her resolve was iron, her calm unnerving. As their fleet set sail toward destiny, the air in Alexandria was thick with incense and silence. The people lined the harbor to watch their queen depart, dressed not in mourning but in gold. Cleopatra waved from the deck, her gaze fixed not on the horizon but on eternity. She knew this battle was not simply for Egypt. It was for her story, her place in the memory of the world. That night, the city of Alexandria slept uneasily. The streets were lit with torches, prayers murmured to Isis echoed through the temples, and the Nile carried its eternal whisper toward the sea. Somewhere, in the quiet of her cabin, Cleopatra wrote a final message to her son Caesarion. Remember, my son, kingdoms fall, but names endure. Guard yours as I have guarded mine. It was both a blessing and a warning. The storm was coming. The gods, it seemed, had taken their sides, and as the horizon burned with dawn, Cleopatra stood at the prow of her ship, eyes steady, heart unbroken. Whatever awaited her beyond the sea, She would meet it as she had met every challenge before, with poise, with purpose, and with the certainty that even in defeat, legend would bow to her name. The sea at Actium shimmered beneath a merciless sun, its waves calm as if mocking the chaos about to unfold. On one side, Cleopatra's ships, sleek, towering vessels adorned with golden prows shaped like rams and sphinxes. On the other, Octavian's fleet, disciplined, smaller, but driven by cold precision. Between them stretched the silence before history changes its course. It was September 2nd, 31 BCE, a day that would decide not only the fate of two lovers but the destiny of an entire civilization. Cleopatra stood upon the deck of her flagship, her armor glinting like molten light. Around her, the sails caught the wind, and drums echoed across the sea. Mark Antony's fleet aligned beside hers, their banners fluttering with defiance. To the world, it was Rome against Egypt, but Cleopatra knew better. It was the old world against the new, tradition against transformation, the crumbling republic against a vision of something greater. If they won, they would reshape the world in their image, a synthesis of East and West. If they lost, her name would become a warning. The first arrows darkened the sky. The battle began with thunder and smoke, with the clash of iron and the cries of men. Antony's ships, larger and slower, struggled to maneuver, while Octavian's commander, Agrippa, struck with ruthless efficiency. Cleopatra's fleet held formation, her Egyptian sailors trained to perfection. The sea churned red and black with fire. Antony fought like the soldier he once was, fearless and desperate, his commands cutting through the roar of war. But beneath the strategy, confusion began to spread. The winds turned. The Roman ships pressed harder. Hours passed. The air grew thick with smoke and screams. Cleopatra watched from her deck, her jaw set, her eyes searching the horizon for a sign of hope, or perhaps of fate. She had chosen this moment knowing the odds. Her ships were mighty but heavy. Octavian's were swift and disciplined. Still, she believed in destiny, in the gods who had carried her so far. Yet even destiny can be strangled by chaos. Then came the signal, the unthinkable. One of her captains, interpreting the battle as lost, began to retreat. In war, hesitation spreads like plague. Cleopatra's flagship turned to follow, not in cowardice, but in calculation. Some historians would later accuse her of fleeing, of betraying Antony. But ancient warfare was not chaos. It was theater, and Cleopatra was always conscious of performance. She believed that preserving her fleet, her resources, and her life might still salvage Egypt. She had seen too many kings die for honor while their kingdoms burned. She would not be one of them. Antony, seeing her sails vanish into the horizon, felt the world collapse. Love and strategy collided in that single instant. He abandoned his command and followed her, leaving his fleet to ruin. To his enemies, it was proof of weakness. To Cleopatra, it was the cruel cost of devotion. The sea that had once bound their dream now drowned it. By dusk, Octavian's flag rose over the waters of Actium, his victory complete. Cleopatra's return to Egypt was shrouded in silence. The queen who had once dazzled the world now sailed home through the ghostly ruins of ambition. Her fleet, though scarred, still carried enough strength to defend Alexandria for a time. But she knew the truth. The empire she and Antony had built was finished. Rome would come for them both, not merely to conquer, but to erase. In the months that followed, Antony remained in despair, haunted by the battle and by his own choices. He withdrew into the palace, lost in wine and memory, his once great will dissolving into regret. Cleopatra, however, did not yield. While Antony drowned in sorrow, she plotted rebirth. She reopened the treasury, reinforced the city walls, and sent envoys to negotiate peace with Octavian. If she could not defeat him in war, perhaps she could charm him in diplomacy, as she once had Caesar. Yet Octavian was no Caesar. He was not moved by charisma or brilliance. He was made of colder material, ambition without imagination. Still, Cleopatra played her role. She presented herself to the people as divine, appearing at festivals as Isis incarnate, the eternal mother. To the priests, she gave offerings, To the merchants, she promised security. Egypt must not see her fear. Even in defeat, she carried herself as though the gods still walked beside her. Her palace became a fortress of illusion. Music in the halls, torches in the gardens, life continuing as though Rome were not breathing down the door. It was not denial, it was dignity. But news from the west grew darker. Octavian's legions advanced across Asia Minor, unstoppable. Allies abandoned Antony one by one. His generals defected, his armies surrendered. By the time word reached Alexandria that Octavian had landed in Egypt, Antony was but a shadow of the man who had once commanded nations. Cleopatra tried to rouse him, to remind him that the story was not over. But love cannot resurrect ambition. As Octavian's forces approached, Cleopatra retreated into the inner sanctum of her palace, a labyrinth of marble and shadow. There, she surrounded herself with treasures, scrolls, and relics of her dynasty. She began to plan for the unimaginable, not victory, but survival after defeat. Rumors spread that she was preparing a hidden tomb, filled with golden gifts, a resting place fit for a goddess. But those who knew her best suspected the truth. Cleopatra was preparing not only for death but for immortality. In the stillness of those final nights, she wrote letters, to her children, to Caesarion, to the priests who would carry her story forward. She instructed her scribes to record her reign not as tragedy, but as transcendence. If Rome wins, she said, let them have my body but not my spirit. Even then, she was thinking of legacy, how her image would survive, how history would remember her. Outside, the city trembled. The people of Alexandria, loyal but fearful, prayed for a miracle that would not come. The harbor, once filled with laughter and trade, now echoed with the sound of Roman drums. The lighthouse still burned, its flames steady against the night, a lonely beacon for a queen whose kingdom was vanishing beneath her feet. On the eve of Octavian's arrival, Cleopatra walked through her gardens one last time. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and the hush of inevitability. She paused by the reflecting pool where she and Antony had once watched the stars. The water, dark and still, mirrored her face. A face that had defied empires, seduced generals, and carried the burden of an ancient land. She reached down, touched the surface, and whispered, "Let them come." When the dawn broke over Alexandria, the horizon was lined with Roman sails. The city's defenders braced for the end, and the Queen of the Nile stood at her balcony, dressed in gold and linen, her crown glinting in the morning light. She was unbroken. Even as fate closed in, she remained what she had always been, a ruler who refused to vanish quietly, a woman who understood that some defeats are merely the beginning of legend. The Roman drums thundered closer, their rhythm steady as fate. Alexandria trembled beneath the sound, its marble streets echoing with the footsteps of conquerors. For centuries, Egypt had been the envy of empires, a kingdom older than memory, its gods older than time. And now, in the summer heat of 30 BCE, it stood on the edge of annihilation. Cleopatra, once the most powerful woman in the world, now faced the most ruthless man Rome had ever produced, Octavian, soon to become Augustus. She had faced storms before, but never one like this. He was not driven by love, glory, or vengeance. He was driven by order, by the desire to erase chaos, and in his mind, Cleopatra was chaos embodied. Mark Antony's soldiers were demoralized, their numbers dwindling, their loyalty fractured. Desertion spread through the ranks like rot. Octavian's propaganda had done its work well. He had convinced even Antony's men that their commander fought for lust, not honor. The Roman general who once commanded legions with a gesture now wandered the palace halls like a ghost, his armor untended, his eyes sunken with shame. Cleopatra saw it all with unflinching clarity. She had loved him deeply, but love was never blind for her. It was strategic, layered with purpose. Yet as Antony fell deeper into despair, she faced a truth she could no longer deny. The empire they had dreamed of was already lost. Still, Cleopatra did not surrender. She sent emissaries to Octavian, offering peace, treasure, even her crown. She knew the art of negotiation better than any ruler alive, and she believed that even Octavian might be tempted by wealth or diplomacy. But Octavian's answer was silence. He did not want her terms. He wanted her humiliation. He wanted Egypt as a trophy, not a partner. And more than that, he wanted her alive, to drag her through the streets of Rome in chains, a living symbol of his triumph. Cleopatra understood what that meant. She knew Rome's taste for spectacle, their hunger for degradation disguised as victory. She had seen the processions of conquered kings and queens, broken and mocked before the crowds. She would not be one of them. As Octavian's forces surrounded Alexandria, Cleopatra retreated into her fortress palace, a city within a city, built of white stone and gold. Its walls still held vast stores of grain. Its halls glowed with torchlight. The library, or what remained of it, still whispered with memory. Yet now all that grandeur felt like the echo of another life. The queen gathered her children close: Caesarion, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. She looked into their faces, each one a reflection of her legacy, her love, her gamble. She told them stories of Isis and Osiris, of the gods who died and rose again, of how power was never truly lost if memory endured. But her eyes, when she looked at Caesarion, lingered longer. He was her greatest hope and greatest danger. Caesarion was 17, poised between boyhood and kingship. To the world, he was the son of Julius Caesar, the last true heir of Rome's greatest name. To Octavian, he was a threat that could never be allowed to live. Cleopatra knew that. She tried to arrange his escape, sending him south along the Nile with loyal guards and hidden gold. Her final words to him, as recorded in legend, were simple and haunting. "Do not trust Rome, my son. They fear what they cannot control." Caesarion looked back once, his eyes mirroring his mother's strength, and then he was gone, vanishing into the desert and into history's uncertainty. That night, Antony received false news that Cleopatra was dead. The rumor spread through the city like wildfire. Shattered, he saw no reason to live. He ordered his servant Eros to kill him, but the man, loyal and trembling, instead killed himself. Antony, left alone, took his sword and fell upon it. But even death would not come easily. Mortally wounded, bleeding, and delirious, he was carried by his guards to Cleopatra's mausoleum, a tomb she had ordered built long before, filled with treasures meant to accompany her into the afterlife. When the queen saw him brought before her, his life fading away, she broke for the first time. The woman who had faced kings and generals without fear now wept openly, holding him as his breath faltered. Ancient writers would later describe the scene in tones of tragedy. Cleopatra cradling Antony's head, his blood staining her robes of gold. "Do not weep," he whispered. "In dying, I am defeated only by greatness." Then, with the faintest smile, he added, "Remember me when you tell our story." And with that, the last of Rome's great soldiers was gone. Cleopatra locked herself in the mausoleum after his death. The Romans surrounded it, expecting her surrender, but she refused to yield. Octavian, fearing she might destroy her treasures or herself, sent emissaries demanding entry. She met them with calm disdain, her eyes cold as obsidian. "Tell your master," she said, "that the Queen of Egypt kneels to no man." Yet in the solitude of her tomb, surrounded by the riches of centuries, she began to make her final preparations. She arranged her jewels with care, set her royal diadem beside her throne, and ordered her servants to dress her in the white robes of Isis. The scent of incense filled the air, mingling with the salt of tears. She wrote letters to Octavian, offering peace one last time, not for herself but for her children. She asked only that they be spared and allowed to live. Whether out of mercy or politics, Octavian agreed. It was enough. When he finally entered the city, Octavian was met not by armies or fanfare, but by silence. The once mighty Alexandria was subdued, its people uncertain, its queen hidden. He sent word for Cleopatra to be brought to him alive, determined to parade her through Rome as the final conquest of the Republic. But he underestimated her. She had already chosen her fate. In her chamber, the Queen of Egypt sat upon her throne for the last time. She wore her crown, her gold bracelets, her white linen shining in the torchlight. At her feet, hidden in a basket of figs, was the small, coiled symbol of eternity, the ASP, sacred to Isis, bringer of death and transformation. Her attendants, faithful to the end, wept quietly as Cleopatra lifted the serpent. "So ends the tale," she said softly. "Not conquered, but complete." When Octavian's men broke through the doors, they found her lifeless, her hand still resting on the snake, her face serene. The two attendants lay beside her, having chosen to follow their queen into eternity. Octavian stared at her body in silence. He had won the world, but in that moment, he understood that some victories are hollow. The woman he had sought to humiliate had denied him the final triumph. She had chosen her own ending, as she had chosen every chapter of her life, with defiance, with elegance, with control. The Romans embalmed her body with honors, burying her beside Antony in a golden tomb near the sea. The Nile carried the rumor of her death across Egypt, from the delta to the deserts. The people mourned not just a queen, but an era. With her passing, Egypt ceased to be a kingdom. It became a province of Rome. The age of pharaohs was over, and yet, Cleopatra had won something far greater than any crown. Her death did not silence her. It immortalized her. Rome might have conquered her kingdom, but it could never conquer her story. From that moment onward, she ceased to be merely a queen. She became legend, an eternal figure woven into the tapestry of power, beauty, and defiance. Even Octavian, soon to be Augustus, carried her memory with a strange reverence. He had feared her influence in life. He would fear her legend in death. When the torches burned low in the marble corridors of the Alexandrian palace, and the sound of the Roman legions faded into the hum of the city beyond, something strange began to happen. Cleopatra's death had not ended her reign. It had transformed it. In the days after her passing, whispers rippled through Alexandria like wind through papyrus leaves. People spoke of strange lights seen above her tomb, of the scent of lotus flowers that lingered in the air though none had been offered. Fishermen swore they saw her reflection upon the waters of the Nile at dawn, watching them as the river flowed quietly toward eternity. The Romans may have believed they had conquered Egypt, but the Egyptians knew better. A queen who died as Isis did not truly die at all. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, ordered that Cleopatra's treasures be catalogued and sent to Rome. Gold, ivory, scrolls, and jewels were piled high like offerings to a new empire. Yet amid the splendor, there were things even his officials could not understand. Strange amulets inscribed with symbols lost to Latin tongues, scrolls of alchemy and philosophy, fragments of ancient hymns that spoke not of death, but of transformation. Some of his men claimed that Cleopatra had left behind instructions for rituals, written in both Greek and Egyptian, describing how the soul could transcend the mortal realm. Others said these were mere myths, born of fear and fascination. But in the centuries to come, these fragments would resurface in places no one expected, hidden within Roman libraries, later copied by Arab scholars, and still later whispered of in secret societies of Renaissance Europe. In Rome, Cleopatra's story became propaganda. Poets and chroniclers reshaped her image into that of a temptress, a sorceress who ensnared great men. Octavian commissioned statues and coins that depicted her with serpents and stars, always paired with symbols of conquest. To him, she was a warning to Rome's citizens, a symbol of what happens when passion overpowers reason. Yet behind this carefully crafted image lay something else: fascination. Rome could not stop talking about her. Even in vilifying her, they gave her immortality. The theater performances that once celebrated Roman victories began to reenact the death of the Queen of the Nile. Painters etched her profile into marble, dramatizing her final moments. They exaggerated her beauty, her cunning, her despair. And though they meant to strip her of dignity, they accomplished the opposite. Cleopatra became myth, and myths cannot be controlled. While Rome claimed her body, Egypt claimed her soul. Priests at the temple of Isis began to weave her into their liturgy. The goddess and the queen merged in story and prayer, two faces of one divine presence. They called her she who returns in the moonlight, the eternal mother of rebirth. For centuries, sailors traveling the Red Sea would leave offerings to her before voyages, praying that her spirit would calm the waters. In the deserts, Bedouin tribes spoke of a veiled woman who appeared in the dunes, guiding lost travelers towards safety. Each story was different, but each bore the same truth. Cleopatra had become something greater than mortal. Meanwhile, in Rome, a quiet guilt haunted Augustus. The man who had claimed to restore order to the world could not erase the memory of the woman who had nearly changed it. He had her son, Caesarion, captured and executed, sealing the end of the Ptolemaic line. Yet when he entered her tomb one final time before departing Egypt, it is said he lingered. The guards reported that he stood before her golden sarcophagus for several minutes, silent, his face unreadable. Then he turned and left, never speaking of it again. But that silence spoke volumes. Decades later, as the empire grew and Augustus became a god in his own right, Cleopatra's image resurfaced in subtle ways. Roman noblewomen adopted her style of dress: white silk robes, jeweled bands around their arms, black kohl outlining their eyes. Even in the heart of the empire that had destroyed her, she became a symbol of power and allure. Philosophers wrote of her as a woman who understood arete, the Greek ideal of excellence, more deeply than any man. The paradox was complete. The enemy of Rome had become one of its muses. But beyond the political and the poetic, there lingered a deeper mystery. Among the scrolls found in her library, those that survived the fires and plunder, were texts on astronomy, alchemy, and metaphysics. Some scholars believe Cleopatra had studied the Hermetic writings attributed to Thoth and Hermes Trismegistus, ancient sources that spoke of the unity between heaven and earth, the divine and the human. If this is true, then her final act, the acceptance of death on her own terms, was not surrender but initiation. She may have seen death as a gateway to divine union, a transformation that mirrored the very teachings she revered. In later centuries, her name began to appear in secret manuscripts connected to the Gnostic traditions. These texts described a queen of wisdom who possessed the keys to both kingdoms, the material and the spiritual. Some scholars argue that this was allegory. Others suggest that Cleopatra's philosophical and mystical studies were passed down through her scholars and priests, preserved even as her empire fell. These ideas would later influence early Christian mysticism, the Hermetic revival of the Renaissance, and even modern esoteric movements. Cleopatra, it seemed, had not only ruled Egypt, she had shaped the spiritual imagination of the Western world. Back in Alexandria, the city continued to live in her shadow. The great lighthouse still burned, guiding ships into the harbor as it had in her time. Traders spoke of her as if she might still appear at any moment, emerging from the mist in her gilded barge. The sands shifted, covering and uncovering fragments of her palaces. Statues of her likeness were worshipped, hidden, rediscovered. Her tomb's exact location was lost, perhaps buried beneath the modern city, perhaps sealed beneath the sea. Archaeologists still search for it today, believing that finding her resting place would unlock new truths about her reign. But perhaps the greatest secret is that she intended never to be found. The queen who mastered appearances may have ensured that her disappearance was the ultimate act of control. Her story passed through the ages, reshaped by every culture it touched. In the Middle Ages, Arab historians described her as a philosopher and scientist. In the Renaissance, she became the symbol of forbidden knowledge. In the Enlightenment, she was a figure of female intellect defying patriarchal history. And in modern times, she became a mirror for every generation's idea of power, beauty, and autonomy. Each era claimed her, but none could contain her. And so, Cleopatra's legacy lived on, not merely in monuments or scrolls, but in the human imagination itself. Every age that dreamed of transformation, of the blending of wisdom and will, found her waiting at its threshold. The Romans believed they had ended a dynasty. What they had really done was give birth to a myth that would never die. In the stillness of the Egyptian night, when the desert winds whisper over the ruins of Alexandria, Some say you can still hear her name carried on the air, not as lamentation but as reminder. For Cleopatra's greatest victory was not over Rome, but over time. She became what she had always desired to be, eternal. Centuries passed, and the sands of Egypt swallowed the palaces, the libraries, and the marble halls where Cleopatra once walked. Rome became an empire, then a memory. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon the Nile, yet her shadow lingered. Her image survived in the quiet corners of temples, in whispered hymns, in stories told by desert fires. Cleopatra, queen, goddess, lover, scholar, refused to vanish. The Romans had taken her body, but they could not take her myth. And as time moved forward, that myth began to reshape itself in strange and unexpected ways. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Egypt had become a land divided between old faiths and new. The temples of Isis still drew pilgrims, though Christianity had begun to spread through Alexandria's streets. But even as new beliefs rose, the memory of Cleopatra seeped into them. The Church Fathers, in their writings, spoke of her as both warning and wonder, a woman of immense knowledge who fell through pride. Yet others saw her differently. In hidden Gnostic sects, Cleopatra's image merged with Sophia, the divine feminine principle of wisdom. To them, she represented not corruption but enlightenment, the eternal seeker who bridges heaven and earth. In the libraries of Alexandria's successors, scholars still copied her treatises on medicine and alchemy, attributing them to her or to her teachers. One such text, the Cleopatris Alchemista, appears in Greek manuscripts dating from the 3rd century CE, describing processes of purification and transformation. Whether the queen herself wrote these words is uncertain, but their authors spoke of her as a vessel of divine understanding. They claimed she possessed the secret of how matter and spirit reflect one another, just as the Nile reflects the sun. To the ancient alchemists, Cleopatra was not just a ruler. She was a philosopher who understood that the outer transformation of metals mirrored the inner transformation of the soul. As centuries turned into millennia, her name traveled along trade routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the east. In the Islamic Golden Age, Arab scholars revered her not as a temptress but as a sage. In their texts, she was called Balkis al-Hakama, Cleopatra the Wise. They wrote that she had constructed observatories, studied the movement of the stars, and translated ancient wisdom into the languages of her time. One legend even claimed she discovered the water of life, a substance that grants renewal to those who understand its spiritual meaning. Meanwhile, in Europe, as the Middle Ages deepened, her legend took on new forms. The Roman version of her, dangerous, seductive, doomed, appealed to poets and chroniclers who saw in her story a reflection of their own fears of power and passion. In the illuminated manuscripts of monks, she appeared as a cautionary figure, the pagan queen who brought down mighty men through the sin of desire. But beneath these moral tales, something more enduring persisted. Artists could not resist her image. Her face appeared in stained glass, her figure carved into church capitals. Even in the most devout settings, Cleopatra's mystery could not be exorcised. Then came the Renaissance, and with it rebirth. Humanist scholars rediscovered the texts of antiquity and began to see Cleopatra anew. To them, she was not a destroyer but a symbol of the union between intellect and emotion, beauty and reason. Artists like Michelangelo and painters like Tiepolo reimagined her not as a sinner but as a sovereign, tragic, yes, but magnificent in her defiance. In her, they saw the eternal question of the Renaissance mind, how to reconcile human passion with divine destiny. Her story became a mirror for an age awakening to knowledge and power. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Cleopatra became theater. Shakespeare gave her immortal voice in his Antony and Cleopatra, a queen whose every word was poetry, whose love defied empires, whose death was triumph, not defeat. "Give me my robe," she declares. "Put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me." It was as if the playwright had reached across time and touched the essence of her truth. The world wept for her again, but this time, it wept in admiration. In that moment, Cleopatra ceased to be history and became the embodiment of art itself, a a story retold to understand what it means to be human. Through the Enlightenment and beyond, her legend shifted once more. Rational minds dismissed the miracles of her reign as myth, yet they could not dismiss her presence. Voltaire wrote of her as an example of political genius constrained by circumstance. Napoleon, centuries later, would visit her homeland and speak of her as the true ruler of Egypt, a figure who held her nation together with intellect rather than armies. Even as the world changed, the fascination with her only deepened. By the 19th century, with the rise of archaeology, Cleopatra's name returned to the sands that had once hidden her. European explorers and scholars descended upon Egypt, armed with shovels and ambition, seeking her tomb. They found fragments, coins bearing her profile, statues carved in her likeness, inscriptions that spoke her titles. Pharaoh of the Two Lands, daughter of Isis, mistress of the Nile. Each discovery fueled the obsession. Painters of the Romantic era turned her into muse and mystery once again. They imagined her surrounded by gold, serpents, and the fading light of empire. Yet beneath the artistic fantasy lay a deeper truth. Every generation that rediscovered Cleopatra was, in some way, trying to rediscover itself. As Egypt fell under new rulers, Ottoman, French, British, her story became a symbol of resistance. Egyptian nationalists of the early 20th century began to reclaim her, not as a seductress or foreign queen, but as a daughter of the Nile, a leader who had fought for her people's independence. Her image appeared in plays, newspapers, and protests. To women, she became an emblem of strength and intelligence in a world still ruled by men. To scholars, she was the embodiment of the bridge between worlds, the last pharaoh, the first modern mind. But even beyond politics and history, her myth carried something universal. Cleopatra represented the idea that power and beauty are fleeting, yet meaning endures. She was the reminder that humanity's deepest struggle is not against others, but against time itself. She stood for every soul who ever dared to dream of immortality, not through conquest, but through understanding. And so, her legend continued to evolve, like the river that once carried her barge under the moonlight. Each civilization that touched her name reshaped it, yet none could claim it entirely. In ancient temples, she was divine. To Rome, she was dangerous. To poets, she was tragic. To philosophers, she was wise. To Egypt, she was eternal. Even today, more than 2,000 years after her death, the search for her tomb continues. Archaeologists dig near the ruins of Taposiris Magna, believing the queen might rest near the temple of Isis herself. Every discovery, every inscription, every relic feels like a whisper from her ghost, a reminder that history is not finished speaking. Perhaps she meant it that way. Perhaps Cleopatra, who so carefully shaped her image, ensured that her final secret would remain just out of reach, so that the world would never stop searching. Because that was her final victory. Not the wealth, not the crown, not the empire, but the endless curiosity she left behind. Cleopatra understood that the greatest power is not to rule others, but to rule memory. And as long as humanity seeks to understand her, she still reigns, somewhere between history and eternity, between myth and truth, her eyes still watching, her name still whispered by the wind that sweeps across the Nile. In the heart of modern Egypt, beneath the sun that still glitters like molten gold over the Nile, Cleopatra's name continues to echo, not only through ruins and relics, but in the living pulse of the land itself. Her story is no longer just a relic of the past. It has become a mirror for every generation that has sought to understand the balance between power and vulnerability, between legacy and loss. As archaeologists and historians dig deeper into the sands, uncovering fragments of her world, they also uncover fragments of something greater. The human desire to be remembered, to leave behind a trace of meaning that outlasts flesh and stone. The 20th century brought new eyes to her legend. For the first time in history, her face reached millions not through temples or scrolls, but through film. In 1963, Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra turned the queen into a global symbol once again. A woman of impossible glamour and unyielding intellect, commanding armies and hearts with equal force. The production itself became a kind of modern myth. Vast sets recreating Alexandria, jewels worth millions, a performance that blurred the line between actress and monarch. To many, Taylor was Cleopatra reborn, embodying the same magnetism that had enthralled Caesar and Antony. Yet beneath the Hollywood spectacle lay something ancient, a fascination that refused to fade, a need to resurrect her once more so that her story could live again. But the cinematic Cleopatra, though iconic, also reignited old debates. Was she truly the manipulative enchantress of Roman propaganda, or was she a visionary ruler misunderstood by history? The question drew scholars, feminists, and historians into passionate argument. Modern research began to peel back the myths created by her enemies, revealing the scholar beneath the legend. Cleopatra was fluent in multiple languages: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and more. She studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy. She negotiated alliances not through seduction but through intellect. She restored Egypt's economy, reformed its currency, and commissioned studies in medicine and agriculture. For all the centuries that had reduced her to beauty and scandal, the truth that emerged was far more extraordinary. She was a scientist, a strategist, a ruler who understood that knowledge was the truest form of power. As the 21st century dawned, technology breathed new life into her world. Archaeologists used satellite imaging to map lost structures buried beneath Alexandria, revealing the outlines of palaces, harbors, and temples that once defined her empire. Divers plunged into the Mediterranean off the coast of the city and discovered remnants of her royal quarter. Columns, statues, even fragments of what may have been her throne. Each artifact, each stone, told a story of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. The sea that once swallowed her city now began to give it back. Among the most tantalizing of discoveries were the ruins near Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria. There, a team led by Dr. Kathleen Martinez uncovered tunnels and chambers that hinted at royal burial sites. Some of the passages stretched for kilometers beneath the earth, carved with symbols of Isis and Osiris, the gods of life, death, and rebirth. Martinez, convinced that Cleopatra's final resting place lay there, called it the Queen's Labyrinth. She believed that Cleopatra, who identified herself as the living Isis, would have chosen to rest near the temple of her goddess. And though the tomb itself has not yet been found, the discoveries have deepened the sense that her story is not finished. Each new excavation feels like a conversation with the past, a voice calling across time, inviting us closer. But perhaps Cleopatra's greatest legacy is not buried under stone or sand. It lives in the ways we see ourselves. To modern women, she represents sovereignty of mind and spirit, the defiance to rule in a world designed to silence them. To historians, she stands as a reminder that history is written by the victors, and that truth must be reclaimed through persistence. To Egypt, she is not the foreign queen of Roman slander, but the last guardian of the Nile's ancient wisdom, a ruler who refused to surrender her people's identity even as empires closed around her. In universities and museums, her name inspires endless study. Her coins are examined not for gold, but for meaning. Her face depicted not as the idealized beauty Rome invented, but as sharp, intelligent, deliberate. Each line of her portrait speaks of confidence, not vanity. Her inscriptions refer to her not as a consort, but as Thea Philopator, the goddess who loves her father. The title itself reflects her understanding of power as lineage and duty, not seduction. And it challenges us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about her. Even in literature and pop culture, Cleopatra's spirit continues to evolve. Writers reimagine her not as a doomed lover, but as a visionary who sought to unify the world's greatest powers. Filmmakers now explore her intellect, her political genius, her bold redefinition of female authority in a patriarchal age. Artists paint her not reclining on a throne, but standing beneath the stars of her kingdom, charting constellations, mapping destiny. She has become less a person than a force, a reminder that greatness often comes at the cost of being misunderstood. Yet the deeper truth that her story reveals goes beyond gender, beyond empire, beyond even history. Cleopatra's life was a meditation on the impermanence of power. She witnessed firsthand how empires crumble, how alliances shift, how even gods can fade. But she also showed that the essence of influence lies not in the throne one sits upon, but in the ideas that endure after the throne is gone. Her reign may have ended in tragedy, but her legacy, her true legacy, reveals that immortality is not found in monuments, but in the hearts and minds she continues to move. Perhaps that was her secret all along. The woman who studied the mysteries of Isis knew that transformation was the highest truth, that death was not an end, but a change of form. And in that sense, Cleopatra succeeded in her final act more than any conqueror ever could. She transformed herself into myth, into symbol, into story. She became an archetype of rebirth. Every time her image is invoked, whether in a temple hymn, a Renaissance fresco, or a modern documentary, she is reborn again, her spirit flowing like the Nile, eternal and unstoppable. Today, as Egypt stands at the crossroads of modernity and memory, the quest to find her continues, not just beneath the earth, but within the collective imagination. Every unearthed statue, every fragment of papyrus, every echo of her voice reminds us that we are all searching for something immortal within ourselves. Perhaps that is why Cleopatra's legacy feels so hauntingly familiar. She was not only a queen, but a reflection of humanity's oldest dream, the dream to be remembered, to transcend time. When the sun sets over the ruins of Alexandria and the call to prayer drifts across the water, it is said that the air still holds a trace of her perfume, the faint scent of lotus and myrrh. The breeze moves through the palm trees like a whisper, and if one listens closely, one might almost hear her voice. Calm, resolute, timeless. I have not died, it seems to say. I have become the story. In the centuries that followed Cleopatra's death, her memory was both preserved and distorted, wrapped in layers of myth, propaganda, and longing. Rome's writers painted her as a seductress whose allure had nearly toppled an empire. To them, she was the embodiment of chaos, a foreign queen who dared to challenge the order of civilization. But beneath their venomous words, something else endured: fascination. No matter how hard they tried to erase her, they could not look away. It was as though Cleopatra had become a mirror for Rome itself, a reflection of power, temptation, and decay. Octavian's victory ensured that his version of history would become law. He renamed himself Augustus and reshaped Cleopatra's downfall into a moral fable, the virtuous Roman defeating the corrupting foreign temptress. In public speeches, she was the embodiment of excess: golden ships, silken sails, decadent feasts. Her story became a warning about what happens when desire outweighs duty. But in private, even Rome's elites could not resist the ghost of her image. Artists carved her likeness into cameos in glass. Poets like Horace and Propertius invoked her as both sinner and saint, a paradox that haunted their verses. The empire could conquer her body, but not her myth. Over time, as the Roman world faded into dust, Cleopatra's legend traveled like a wandering spirit, reinvented with every passing age. In Byzantium, she was remembered not as a ruler but as a symbol of worldly vanity. In medieval Europe, Christian scholars wrote of her with a mix of horror and fascination, casting her as both harlot and tragic queen. Yet even in condemnation, they could not help but admire her intellect and beauty. The centuries blurred the lines between fact and imagination until she became something more than human, a mythic presence, half history, half dream. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, a rebirth of her image. Artists like Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Raphael rediscovered the classical world, and Cleopatra emerged anew. No longer a villain, but a muse. Painters rendered her final moments in luminous detail: the pale skin, the serpent coiled upon her arm, the calm dignity in her eyes. Her suicide, once viewed as an act of disgrace, was now interpreted as defiance, a queen's last assertion of control over her fate. She was not conquered. She chose her own ending. That image resonated deeply with an age that celebrated individuality and genius. Cleopatra became the embodiment of the human spirit's refusal to submit. Writers, too, resurrected her. In Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, She is magnificent and flawed, part goddess, part woman, a figure of boundless passion and power. Shakespeare's verses shimmer with contradictions. She is proud and playful, cruel and tender, loyal and faithless. Yet through it all, she is irresistibly alive. For the first time, Western audiences saw not just the myth but the human being within it. Shakespeare's Cleopatra laughs, weeps, commands, and trembles. Her love for Antony becomes not a weapon, but a window into her soul. Through her, Shakespeare asked an enduring question. Can love and power ever truly coexist? As centuries passed, the world changed, but Cleopatra's shadow remained. In the Age of Empire, European colonizers looked upon Egypt as both a treasure and a mystery. They looted her tombs, carried off her statues, and rewrote her story in their own image. To the Victorians, she was the ultimate Oriental temptress, a fantasy that justified their own sense of superiority. Painters like Alma-Tadema and Jerome filled canvases with imagined scenes of her court, luxurious, sensual, unreal. The real Cleopatra disappeared beneath silk and smoke, buried once again beneath layers of invention. And yet, even this distortion could not kill her legend. The more they tried to contain her, the more she evolved. As women in the modern world began to demand agency, education, and equality, Cleopatra's image transformed again. She became a symbol of female sovereignty, an icon of intellect, ambition, and courage in a world ruled by men. The suffragists of the early 20th century invoked her name as proof that women could wield power and wisdom equal to any man. Writers like George Bernard Shaw and later Margaret George reimagined her not as a courtesan, but as a stateswoman. Through their words, she reclaimed her throne. Meanwhile, Egypt itself began to rediscover her legacy. Nationalists and historians sought to reclaim her from the hands of Western interpreters. They saw in her not a Greek outsider, but an Egyptian queen who defended her homeland's independence until the very end. The idea that Cleopatra represented the last light of Egypt's ancient sovereignty became a rallying point for a new kind of pride. She was no longer just a historical figure. She was a symbol of identity, resilience, and cultural rebirth. But perhaps what truly cements Cleopatra's place in the human imagination is the way she blurs the boundaries between myth and memory. Unlike many historical figures, she was never reduced to a single story. She exists in the spaces between East and West, goddess and woman, truth and legend. Each age reinvents her according to its desires and fears. In that sense, Cleopatra is not just remembered. She is continually reborn. And that rebirth extends beyond art and literature into the very fabric of human aspiration. Psychologists have noted how her story resonates deeply with themes of control, identity, and mortality. She embodies the eternal conflict between destiny and desire, intellect and emotion. Her life asks a question that every generation must answer anew. What does it mean to hold power, and at what cost? As the 20th century unfolded, Cleopatra's story entered new mediums: film, music, even fashion. She appeared not only as Elizabeth Taylor's glittering goddess, but also as a muse for designers, writers, and visionaries across the world. Each portrayal, no matter how exaggerated, carried an echo of truth, the allure of a woman who refused to be confined by her time. Her image became a statement, a declaration that beauty and intelligence, passion and leadership could coexist. Even now, her influence lingers in places we do not expect. When leaders speak of image, charisma, and soft power, they speak a language she mastered 2,000 years ago. When women rise to lead nations, corporations, or movements, they walk in footsteps that trace back to the marble halls of Alexandria. Cleopatra's strategies of diplomacy, her understanding of narrative, her ability to merge intellect with emotion, all remain relevant. She anticipated the modern age in ways her contemporaries could never have imagined. And yet, her story remains unfinished. For every rediscovered artifact, for every retelling that seeks to restore her truth, there is always something just out of reach, another mystery waiting beneath the sand. Perhaps that is what makes her legacy so enduring. We will never completely know her. She invites endless pursuit, endless interpretation. Cleopatra is both history's most visible woman and its most elusive. As we follow the threads of her story, from the scrolls of Rome to the silver screens of Hollywood, from the marble of Renaissance art to the data of digital archives, we find that the deeper we look, the more we see ourselves reflected in her gaze. She is ambition, love, brilliance, pride, and tragedy. She is the eternal question of what it means to be remembered. And in that reflection, her immortality lives on, shimmering like the Nile beneath a full moon, forever flowing, forever reborn. The mystery surrounding Cleopatra's final resting place has haunted archaeologists for generations. Her death is one of the most well-documented moments in antiquity, yet what followed is shrouded in darkness. No ancient historian ever confirmed where her body was laid to rest. The silence is deafening. Some believed her tomb was destroyed by earthquakes that reduced Alexandria's royal quarter to ruins. Others whisper that her grave remains hidden, sealed in secrecy by loyal priests who refuse to let Rome defile her remains. But for centuries, this absence, the missing queen, has become a story in itself, a symbol of mystery as immortal as Cleopatra's legend. From the moment of her death, Cleopatra became the subject of obsession. Roman chroniclers such as Plutarch and Dio Cassius wrote that Octavian allowed her to be buried with Antony, honoring her final wish. Yet even this act of mercy might have been a political illusion, a gesture meant to pacify Egypt's people while consolidating Rome's control. No evidence has ever been found of such a tomb, no inscription, no monument. The queen who once ruled from palaces of marble vanished from the world without a trace. It was as though she had dissolved into myth. For archaeologists, this disappearance poses not just a historical puzzle, but an emotional one. The tomb of a ruler is not simply a burial site. It is a declaration of identity, a voice from beyond the grave. Pharaohs built pyramids to defy time. Kings raised obelisks and temples to ensure their names would echo through eternity. But Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, left behind nothing that bears her name. Was it destruction, or a deliberate act of concealment? Some scholars believe she wanted to disappear, that she understood the power of mystery, and chose to let her final chapter remain unwritten. Still, others refuse to accept that such a figure could vanish forever. For decades, teams have scoured the Alexandrian coast and its surrounding deserts, driven by one unshakable belief. Somewhere, beneath the shifting sands or the sea's blue veil, Cleopatra waits. Her tomb, if found, would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. A bridge between myth and reality, restoring a voice long silenced by empire. And among the seekers, none has pursued this dream more passionately than Dr. Kathleen Martinez. Martinez, a Dominican archaeologist, devoted over 2 decades of her life to Cleopatra's mystery. Her journey began not in Egypt, but in a library. Studying ancient texts, she noticed something overlooked by earlier scholars: a series of religious references linking Cleopatra to the goddess Isis and a particular temple, Taposiris Magna, located about 45 kilometers west of Alexandria. This temple was dedicated to Osiris, the god of the underworld, and to Isis, the goddess of rebirth. To Martinez, it made perfect symbolic sense. Cleopatra saw herself as the living embodiment of Isis, and her death, her merging with Antony, mirrored the myth of Isis reuniting with her slain husband Osiris. If Cleopatra wished to immortalize this divine connection, she might have chosen to rest not in the royal quarter, but beside the gods themselves. In 2004, Martinez began excavations at Taposiris Magna under the supervision of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities. What she found stunned the world. Deep beneath the temple, her team uncovered a labyrinth of tunnels, more than 4,000 feet long, carved from solid rock, stretching beneath the ancient walls. The passages were lined with carvings of Isis and Osiris, and offerings of coins and amulets bearing Cleopatra's image. Within the chambers lay mummies adorned with gold, their wrappings soaked in resin, suggesting individuals of high status, possibly priests or nobles who served during Cleopatra's reign. Then came the discovery that ignited global fascination: a pair of alabaster heads believed to represent Cleopatra and Antony. The resemblance was uncanny. Delicate features, regal bearing, unmistakably Ptolemaic. Nearby, archaeologists found ceramic fragments and a partial bust that seemed to confirm the era. For Martinez, this was not coincidence. Each clue, each artifact, was a whisper guiding her closer to the truth. The tunnels, she believed, were part of a sacred route leading to the queen's hidden tomb. But archaeology is never certain, and Egypt guards its secrets fiercely. Despite years of work, the tomb itself remains undiscovered. Some experts have questioned Martinez's theory, arguing that no Ptolemaic monarch would be buried outside Alexandria's royal quarter. Others suggest that the structure beneath Taposiris Magna may have served as a ceremonial site, a place where Cleopatra's cult followers mourned and worshipped her as a goddess after death. Yet even skeptics admit the possibility cannot be dismissed. The evidence is tantalizing, incomplete, like pieces of a mosaic waiting for the missing tile that will reveal the full picture. What makes the search so compelling is not merely the hope of discovery, but what it represents, the restoration of a voice. For centuries, Cleopatra's story has been told by her enemies, her lovers, and her admirers, but not by her. Her tomb, if found, would speak in her own language, through the objects she chose to accompany her into eternity. What books did she take with her? What treasures, what symbols of faith or power? Would there be scrolls that reveal her thoughts on Rome, on Antony, on her own death? In that silent chamber, hidden for 2 millennia, could lie the final truth of who Cleopatra truly was. But beyond the allure of gold and marble lies something deeper, a sense of poetic justice. Cleopatra's life was one of visibility. Every gesture, every alliance, every mistake played out before the eyes of the world. Her death, however, became her final act of control, a mystery she authored herself. Perhaps she wanted to ensure that long after empires had fallen, she would still command our imagination. And she has. Her missing tomb has made her eternal. Modern Egyptologists describe the search as a dialogue between the living and the dead. Each excavation, each fragment of pottery, each hieroglyph uncovered brings us closer, not only to Cleopatra, but to understanding the nature of remembrance itself. Why do we search for her? Because she represents the part of humanity that refuses to fade, the need to connect, to uncover, to resurrect what time has buried. As drones and ground-penetrating radar now scan the sands around Taposiris Magna, as satellite imaging reveals ancient foundations unseen by the human eye, one truth remains. The queen's final secret endures. Whether her tomb lies beneath the temple, the waves of the Mediterranean, or lost forever in history's folds, it continues to whisper across time, pulling us closer. In the end, perhaps it is not discovery that gives Cleopatra her immortality, but the pursuit itself. She has become the eternal quest, a mystery that refuses resolution. Every archaeologist who lifts a brush to the sand, every historian who pores over a forgotten text, becomes part of her story. Cleopatra may have died more than 2,000 years ago, but in our relentless search for her, she lives on, commanding the world's attention as she always did. Unseen, unbroken, and unforgettable. The more scholars uncover about Cleopatra, the more her influence seems to reach beyond time itself. Her legacy is not confined to ancient stones or the dust of forgotten temples. It flows through language, art, politics, and the very shape of how humanity understands power. What began as the story of a queen has become a mirror through which entire civilizations reflect their values, fears, and desires. Cleopatra's legacy is not a single narrative. It is a constellation of meanings, a mosaic of ideas that continues to evolve with every generation that dares to interpret her. In the centuries following her death, Cleopatra became an icon of paradox. To some, she was the last guardian of Egyptian culture, standing defiant before the advancing tide of Roman imperialism. To others, she was the first modern politician, skilled in diplomacy, fluent in symbolism, and keenly aware of how image could shape reality. She transformed politics into theater and leadership into art. Every gesture, every alliance, every decision she made was an act of communication as much as strategy. Even her most personal choices were political. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were not mere affairs of passion. They were acts of statecraft, designed to preserve her nation's sovereignty. This understanding of power as performance, of identity as a tool, would echo through history. Centuries later, monarchs like Elizabeth I of England and Catherine the Great of Russia would employ similar tactics, crafting images of divine femininity and intellect to legitimize their rule. Cleopatra's mastery of presentation became the unspoken manual of female power in a world governed by men. She taught that appearance was not vanity, but weaponry. Her makeup, her clothing, her words, all were extensions of her will. She controlled how others saw her, turning perception into influence. Even beyond politics, Cleopatra's intellectual legacy reshaped how the world viewed Egypt itself. The Library of Alexandria, once the beating heart of learning in the ancient world, became mythologized through her connection to it. Though it was founded long before her reign, Cleopatra was its final protector. Under her rule, scholars and philosophers continued to gather there, debating astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. In an age when most rulers sought conquest, Cleopatra sought comprehension. Her reign symbolized the meeting of two civilizations, Greek rationalism and Egyptian mysticism, and from that fusion came a new understanding of the world. She stood at the crossroads of cultures, embodying the unity of East and West long before such ideas existed in modern thought. Her influence also seeped into religion. After her death, the cult of Isis grew stronger across the Roman Empire. Temples dedicated to the goddess appeared in Rome, Pompeii, and beyond, bearing symbols that merged Egyptian and Greco-Roman iconography. For centuries, Isis worship remained a spiritual force, and in its rituals, the hymns, the incense, the concept of divine motherhood, one can sense Cleopatra's enduring imprint. Some scholars have even suggested that aspects of Isis worship later influenced early Christian traditions of Mary, the mother figure who bridges the divine and human. If so, then Cleopatra's belief in rebirth and divine femininity found new life in ways she could never have imagined. But Cleopatra's legacy was not only spiritual, it was linguistic. Her very name became a symbol, passed down through dynasties, whispered in poems, and inscribed on monuments. The name Cleopatra means glory of her father, and that meaning glory, pride, heritage, became attached to her identity forever. Throughout history, countless women have been named Cleopatra, particularly in Greece, Egypt, and Ethiopia, as if invoking her strength through repetition. Her identity became a vessel for continuity, linking generations across centuries. In art, she remained a muse of infinite faces. Renaissance painters depicted her as a tragic heroine, her beauty illuminated by candlelight as she embraced death. Neoclassical sculptors carved her in marble, serene and composed, her arm extended toward the fatal serpent. Each portrayal reflected not Cleopatra herself, but the era that imagined her. In the Romantic Age, she was passion personified, a woman of emotion and rebellion. In the modern age, she became intellect and autonomy, her allure tied not to submission but to strength. Cleopatra's power lay in her adaptability. She was reborn in every medium, every movement, every century. The political symbolism of Cleopatra also endured in subtle, unexpected ways. When European colonial powers occupied Egypt in the 19th century, they used her story to frame their conquest as a restoration of lost civilization. But for Egyptians, Cleopatra represented something entirely different: resistance, continuity, pride. She was proof that Egypt's greatness was not a gift from outsiders but a creation of its own people. Artists and poets of the Egyptian Renaissance in the early 20th century invoked her as a symbol of independence and cultural revival. Even today, she remains a figure of national identity, a queen who stood against empire and refused to surrender her autonomy. Her influence can even be traced in science and philosophy. Modern leadership studies cite her as one of the earliest examples of emotional intelligence in power. Cleopatra knew that charisma was not manipulation but connection, that to lead people, one must make them feel seen, valued, inspired. This understanding, which psychological theorists now call transformational leadership, was her natural instinct. She ruled not merely through decree but through engagement, fostering loyalty among those who served her. She was a master of empathy in politics, a skill few have ever matched. Yet there is another layer to her legacy, one that transcends culture and time: the idea of transformation itself. Cleopatra's life embodied the cycles of creation and destruction that define human existence. She built alliances, lost them, rose again, and faced ruin. Her death became not an end, but a transformation into myth, a living embodiment of the Egyptian belief that the soul endures beyond death. Through her story, she achieved what every pharaoh sought: immortality. And in this sense, Cleopatra's influence reaches into the modern psyche. She reminds us that legacy is not what one possesses, but what one inspires. Power fades, kingdoms fall, but the story, if it captures the imagination, can outlast them all. She understood this better than anyone. By shaping her image in life, she ensured her survival in death. Every retelling, every painting, every film, every whisper of her name fulfills her ultimate triumph: to be remembered. If we strip away the layers of myth and propaganda, what remains is a truth both simple and profound. Cleopatra's legacy is the story of a mind that dared to dream beyond its time. She sought unity in a divided world, knowledge in an age of superstition, equality in a society built on hierarchy. She was a scholar, a scientist, a queen, and above all, a human being who believed in the power of will to shape destiny. And perhaps that is why her influence still breathes today. She has become a symbol for all who live between worlds, for those who must balance love and duty, intellect and emotion, self and society. Cleopatra's true legacy is not the marble and gold of her vanished empire, but the invisible empire she built in human thought, the belief that greatness lies not in what we inherit, but in what we create. When one stands before the ruins of Alexandria, watching the sun sink into the Mediterranean, the light reflecting in shifting bands of gold and crimson, it is easy to imagine that somewhere, in that fading glow, Cleopatra's gaze lingers still, proud, knowing, eternal. Her empire may have fallen, but her influence remains unbroken, carried forward not by monuments, but by memory itself. There is a quiet but profound irony in Cleopatra's legacy. Though she ruled over the physical world, the Nile, the palaces, the armies, it is in the realm of the unseen that she has proven unconquerable. Her influence has endured not in marble, not in the gold that once adorned her throne, but in the invisible architecture of ideas. 2 millennia after her death, her presence still shapes how the world perceives beauty, intelligence, and leadership. And yet, beneath that glow, the question lingers like a shadow: who was she, truly? Beneath the stories and symbols, what heartbeat belonged to the woman history transformed into myth? To understand that deeper truth, one must return to her city, Alexandria. In its time, it was a place unlike any other. A city of glass and marble, where merchants, philosophers, and dreamers from every corner of the world mingled in its sunlit courtyards. Its library, legendary even then, stood as a temple to the human mind. Knowledge itself was worshipped there. Scrolls from Greece, Persia, India, and Egypt filled its halls. Ideas crossed languages as easily as ships crossed the Mediterranean. This was the world Cleopatra inherited, a realm of fusion, of ceaseless exchange between cultures. She was not merely the last pharaoh. She was the last guardian of a civilization that believed knowledge could bridge all divides. But when Rome took Egypt, that bridge collapsed. The empire that conquered her prized order over imagination, conquest over curiosity. The Ptolemaic dynasty's dream of uniting wisdom and rule was extinguished, and with it, much of the ancient world's intellectual light. The library that had preserved human thought was burned. Whether in war or neglect, no one knows for sure. What was lost in that fire was more than parchment. It was possibility itself. Cleopatra's death became the closing of an age. Yet from that ending emerged something unexpected: rebirth. Over the centuries, as her story traveled through languages and lands, it became a vessel carrying fragments of that lost wisdom. Through her, people remembered Egypt not as a fallen empire, but as a place of mystery and mastery, a civilization where science and spirituality walked hand in hand. In this way, Cleopatra became not only a historical figure but a guardian of memory, her legend keeping alive the idea that knowledge was sacred. Even now, echoes of her world survive in the modern one. Alexandria, though largely rebuilt, remains a city of knowledge, its new library, a modern marvel of glass and light, standing on the same ground where the ancient one once stood. Its architects designed it as a circular symbol, open to the sky, as though offering homage to the eternal sun that once warmed Cleopatra's reign. Inside, scholars from across the world gather once more, studying history, astronomy, literature, everything she once valued. It is as if, after 2,000 years, her dream has returned, shimmering again above the same waters where her ships once sailed. Yet the modern fascination with Cleopatra also reveals something intimate about humanity itself. Every generation reshapes her according to its fears and hopes. In the 19th century, she was portrayed as the exotic femme fatale, her story warning against the dangers of female power. In the 20th, she became an emblem of glamour and rebellion, her image adorning films and novels that celebrated independence and allure. And in the 21st century, she has transformed once more into a symbol of complexity, intersectionality, and the enduring question of identity. Was she Greek, Egyptian, both? Neither? She defied labels in her own time, and she continues to defy them now. In an era obsessed with definitions, she remains the ultimate paradox, a woman who refused to be reduced to a single truth. Modern historians, armed with science, have begun to peel away the centuries of myth. Advances in genetic research, satellite imaging, and underwater archaeology are reconstructing her world with unprecedented clarity. Yet even as technology illuminates new details, it also deepens the mystery. We may one day map every inch of her kingdom, but we will never fully map her mind. Cleopatra's genius lay not only in her intellect, but in her understanding that power is not control, it is connection. She wove alliances like a spider's web, drawing strength not from domination, but from understanding the desires and fears of others. She made politics personal, empathy strategic. It is a lesson that modern leaders, 2 millennia later, still struggle to learn. But Cleopatra's influence was not confined to courts and kingdoms. It reached the realm of art, philosophy, and the human spirit. Artists from Caravaggio to Gustav Klimt found in her death an almost unbearable beauty, the image of the serpent's kiss, the quiet dignity of a woman choosing her fate. Poets from Dryden to Cavafy wrote of her as both queen and phantom, the eternal muse who embodies longing itself. In each portrayal, something of her essence endures, that blend of intelligence and emotion, majesty and mortality. She reminds the world that greatness and vulnerability are not opposites, they are intertwined. In recent years, new artistic movements have sought to reclaim her image from centuries of Western reinterpretation. Egyptian and African scholars have emphasized her heritage, her political insight, her cultural identity. Films and documentaries now depict her not as a seductress, but as a scientist, philosopher, and mother, a ruler burdened by empire yet unbroken by it. These retellings seek not only to honor her, but to restore the depth of her humanity. For so long, Cleopatra was defined by how men saw her. Now, at last, she is being seen on her own terms. Yet even as we uncover new truths, her story retains its ancient rhythm, the cycle of rise and fall, of creation and loss. The Egypt she ruled no longer exists, but the longing for what she represented remains. The dream of harmony between power and wisdom, passion and intellect, self and state. Her life was a testament to that dream, her death a warning of its fragility. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate. It is not only about her, it is about us, our desire to leave something behind that outlasts the body, the empire, even time itself. When we look at the fragments of her world, the coins bearing her face, the papyri marked with her signature, the broken statues that once stood in her court, we are not just looking at relics. We are looking at evidence of human ambition at its purest form, the will to be more than mortal. Cleopatra lived with the knowledge that everything she built could crumble, and still she built. She loved knowing her love could destroy her, and still she loved. That courage to act despite impermanence is her truest legacy. Tonight, somewhere on the Egyptian coast, the sea laps gently against the ruins of her palace, the same waters that once reflected the torchlight of her ships. The moon casts its silver path across the waves, and for a moment, the past feels close enough to touch. In that silence, the boundary between now and then dissolves, and one can almost sense her presence. The queen who outwitted empires, who faced death with grace, who made her own name immortal. Cleopatra's voice, long lost to the wind, still speaks in the language of eternity. She reminds us that time does not erase greatness, it only transforms it. The centuries following Cleopatra's death were marked by silence. A silence heavy with loss, myth, and misinterpretation. Her Egypt was swallowed whole by Rome, its temples repurposed, its gods renamed, its queen reduced to a cautionary tale whispered by victors. Yet history, like the Nile, has a way of resurfacing what is buried. Beneath the dust of empire and the bias of chroniclers, the pulse of her legacy endured. It flowed unseen, shaping thought and imagination across civilizations. In medieval manuscripts, Renaissance art, and Enlightenment philosophy, her name reappeared like a secret code, Cleopatra as the eternal enigma, the embodiment of beauty, knowledge, and forbidden power. She became a mirror through which each age reflected its own fears and desires. For the early Christians of late antiquity, she was the embodiment of pagan decadence, a warning of worldly temptation. To them, her fall justified the rise of Rome as the divine will of providence. But in the shadows of monasteries, copyists who preserved the ancient texts also preserved her memory. Even as they condemned her, they could not let her story vanish. The tension between admiration and judgment became the thread that kept her alive. By the Middle Ages, Arabic scholars, inheriting the intellectual torch of the Greeks and Egyptians, saw her not as a sinner, but as a scientist. In their writings, Cleopatra appears as an alchemist, a seeker of hidden truths, the patroness of secret wisdom. Legends arose claiming she had written treatises on medicine, astronomy, and the transmutation of metals, texts that allegedly vanished with the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Whether fact or fiction, these tales reframed her not as a fallen queen, but as a philosopher queen. The Renaissance rekindled her flame with newfound intensity. Artists, breaking free from the rigid morality of the church, rediscovered the sensual and intellectual power of the classical world. Cleopatra returned to life in frescoes and sculptures, her image revived through the eyes of painters like Titian and Michelangelo. To them, she was not a seductress but a symbol of sovereignty. Beauty fused with intellect, passion balanced by wisdom. In these works, her death was portrayed not as tragedy but as triumph, the moment when a mortal transcends the limits of time. The asp pressed to her breast became a gesture of defiance, a refusal to let history define her. In literature, her story deepened. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra transformed her from a distant myth into a living, breathing soul. She became wit and warmth, pride and vulnerability, a woman whose love was both her glory and her undoing. In his words, age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. The bard captured the truth that history had always struggled to contain. Cleopatra was not a symbol, she was a force of nature. Every reader, every viewer, sees a different reflection in her. That is her genius. She cannot be confined to a single interpretation. As Europe moved into the Enlightenment, her image evolved again. Rational minds of the era sought to strip myth from history, to see her as a political actor rather than a romantic figure. Historians began to question the Roman sources that had painted her as manipulative and immoral. New voices suggested that her reign had been one of calculated diplomacy, cultural fusion, and visionary governance. Yet even as scholars sought to demystify her, the poets and artists refused to let the enchantment fade. She became both the subject of science and the muse of art, a dual existence that continues to this day. The 19th century, however, reimagined her in a way that both glorified and diminished her. As European powers colonized Egypt, Cleopatra became a symbol of exotic otherness, an emblem of the East that Western artists romanticized and controlled. In operas like Massenet's Cleopatra and paintings by Jerome, she was rendered in gold and shadow, reclining among incense and servants. Her intelligence was acknowledged, but overshadowed by sensuality. The colonial gaze turned her into an object, her power reframed as spectacle. Yet even in this distortion, something of her essence survived. Beneath the Orientalism, audiences could still sense the defiance in her eyes, the silent accusation of a queen misrepresented by those who sought to own her image. Then came the 20th century, an age of screens and spectacle. Hollywood resurrected Cleopatra with dazzling grandeur. Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal in 1963 became an icon of cinematic excess, a film so lavish it nearly bankrupted its studio. But beyond the jewels and costumes, Taylor's performance captured something rare: the vulnerability beneath the crown. Her Cleopatra was witty, proud, and flawed, a woman wrestling with love and destiny. For many, it was the first time Cleopatra felt human again. Yet even then, her story was filtered through Western lenses, more romance than history. In the latter half of the century, as feminism reshaped cultural narratives, Cleopatra's legend was reclaimed once more. Scholars began to read between the lines of Roman propaganda, revealing the political motives behind her vilification. They pointed out how ancient historians, writing under Augustus, sought to portray her as the foreign temptress who corrupted noble Roman men. This was not history, it was politics. By painting her as a villain, Rome justified its conquest of Egypt and the death of its last sovereign ruler. The realization shifted everything. Cleopatra was not the destroyer of men. She was the victim of empire, her legacy rewritten by those who feared her intelligence. Modern archaeology has added new layers to this revision. Excavations around Alexandria and Taposiris Magna have uncovered coins, inscriptions, and artifacts that challenge old assumptions. Coins minted in her reign depict her with a strong jawline, not the delicate beauty of legend, but the determined face of a ruler. Inscriptions describe her as Philopatrus, lover of her country. These details, small as they are, form a counter-narrative. Cleopatra was not merely surviving Rome's encroachment. She was striving to preserve Egypt's independence through strategy, diplomacy, and vision. Today, the rediscovery of Cleopatra's truth has become a global endeavor. Historians from Egypt, Greece, Africa, and beyond collaborate to reconstruct her story from fragments scattered across millennia. Each new piece of evidence feels like a resurrection, a whisper from the queen herself, reminding us that her story is not finished. She has outlived every empire that sought to erase her. Her image has been destroyed and remade countless times, but her essence, the fierce intellect, the courage to defy fate, remains unbroken. And perhaps that is her greatest revenge. Not the triumphs of her armies, not the splendor of her palaces, but endurance itself. While the names of her enemies crumble in forgotten tombs, hers continues to echo across ages. Each reinterpretation, each retelling, ensures she never dies completely. She evolves with us, a reflection of humanity's shifting understanding of power, identity, and truth. From queen to myth, from myth to memory, Cleopatra transcends history's attempts to define her. As the modern world reclaims her voice, one truth becomes clear. She is no longer Rome's conquered queen. She is history's most enduring survivor. Her story, like the Nile, bends and twists through time, but it never ceases to flow. The torch she carried, the union of wisdom and will, intellect and passion, still burns. And in that flame, flickering through centuries of retelling, her shadow stretches long over the world she left behind, whispering that no matter how often the victors write the story, the truth has a way of finding its way back into the light. In the quiet chambers of time, Cleopatra's shadow continues to lengthen, not merely as a queen of Egypt, but as a phenomenon that transcends her age. Her story has become a code within civilization itself, replicated in myths, echoed in art, and reborn in revolutions of thought. Yet, among all her echoes, there is one seldom spoken of, the secret lineage of influence she left behind, woven not through blood, but through ideas. The ancient world may have buried her body, but her philosophy, her understanding of power, identity, and the fragility of destiny, flowed onward like a current beneath the surface of history. This unseen inheritance, passed from mind to mind, has shaped rulers, artists, and thinkers in ways few recognize. The roots of this legacy reach into the centuries immediately after her death. When Octavian, soon to be Augustus, seized Egypt, he sought to erase her from memory. Statues were defaced, inscriptions chiseled away, and temples rededicated. Yet, paradoxically, the attempt to silence her made her immortal. The very empire that tried to destroy her absorbed fragments of her image into its own mythology. Roman women, hearing whispers of her charm and intellect, began adopting Egyptian styles. Braided hair, kohl-lined eyes, and robes dyed with the deep hues once reserved for queens. The Romans, in their hunger to dominate Egypt, unknowingly allowed her aesthetic to infiltrate their own culture. The conqueror had become the vessel of the conquered. Her influence seeped deeper still into the intellectual life of the Mediterranean. Philosophers of the late Roman and early Byzantine worlds, influenced by the Hermetic writings believed to have originated in Hellenistic Egypt, carried forward a worldview Cleopatra herself would have understood. That knowledge was divine, that the cosmos and the human mind mirrored each other, and that wisdom was the true source of power. Though her name was absent from these texts, the philosophical fusion of Greek rationalism and Egyptian mysticism that flourished in her city bore her invisible signature. She had ruled over a kingdom that valued this synthesis. After her, it became the seed from which Western esotericism and later the Renaissance itself would grow. By the time the Middle Ages darkened Europe, the memory of Cleopatra had fragmented into paradoxes. Half witch, half scholar, half sinner, half saint. In alchemical texts attributed to Cleopatra the philosopher, she was portrayed as an initiate into sacred mysteries, her experiments with transformation symbolizing the soul's journey from base matter to divine illumination. Whether she actually wrote such treatises or not mattered less than what they represented. The enduring idea of a woman who sought hidden knowledge and dared to wield it. In an age when women were denied access to learning, her myth became a quiet rebellion, a whisper across centuries that intellect knew no gender. When the Renaissance dawned, that whisper became a voice. Artists and humanists, rediscovering classical antiquity, found in Cleopatra a figure who embodied both reason and desire. She became the muse of thinkers grappling with the nature of individuality and the responsibilities of power. Her story inspired reflections on what it meant to rule wisely, to love dangerously, to die with dignity. The humanists of Florence and Venice, obsessed with virtue and fame, saw in her the perfect paradox. A ruler undone by emotion, yet elevated by intellect. A mortal woman whose choices echoed through eternity. In this contradiction lay her genius and her curse. Through the centuries that followed, her shadow continued to move with history's pulse. Enlightenment thinkers revisited her life not as tragedy, but as a philosophical puzzle. Voltaire and Diderot saw her as a victim of propaganda, a symbol of how truth is distorted by power. Romantic poets turned her into a symbol of passion unbound, of love that refuses to yield to reason. Painters like Alma Tadema recreated her world in dreamlike hues, bathing her in gold light that suggested both splendor and decay. Each generation, in reaching for Cleopatra, revealed more about itself than about her. She had become a mirror of civilization's evolving conscience, a canvas upon which humanity painted its longing for wisdom, beauty, and freedom. But perhaps her most surprising legacy lies not in art or myth, but in the evolution of political thought. Cleopatra's reign, studied through the lens of modern leadership, reveals an understanding of diplomacy far ahead of its time. She was among the first rulers to recognize the power of narrative, of shaping perception as much as policy. She knew that image could be weaponized, that mythology could reinforce authority. By presenting herself as both divine and deeply human, she created a dual identity that allowed her to bridge cultures. This concept of a leader who rules not by fear, but by charisma and communication, would echo centuries later in figures as diverse as Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, and even modern political icons. Whether consciously or not, they inherited Cleopatra's art of the image. Even the feminist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries found resonance in her story. Cleopatra became an emblem of autonomy in a patriarchal world, a woman who refused to be passive, who chose her alliances, her lovers, her fate. In her defiance of subjugation, she became a symbol of self-determination. For women writers from George Eliot to Nawal el-Saadawi, she was not merely a historical figure, but a kind of ancestral spirit, a reminder that intellect and femininity were not contradictions, but forces of equal power. The more patriarchal societies tried to diminish her as a temptress, the stronger she became as a symbol of liberation. Her influence also lingered in the visual language of modern culture. The sleek eyeliner of contemporary fashion, the serpent motif in jewelry, the fascination with gold and turquoise, all trace aesthetic roots to her court. In design and cinema alike, Cleopatra's visual identity has become shorthand for mystery and mastery. The 20th century's fascination with Egyptomania, from Art Deco motifs to the pyramidal architecture of modern monuments, reflects a subconscious yearning for her world, for that lost harmony of intellect, sensuality, and spiritual depth. And yet, her legacy is not merely artistic or political. It is existential. Cleopatra's story, stripped to its essence, asks the oldest human question. How does one confront impermanence? She understood, perhaps better than any ruler before or since, that all power is fleeting. Kingdoms crumble, lovers fade, and beauty is devoured by time. Her answer was not despair, it was creation. She built, spoke, acted, and loved with the awareness that the sands would eventually reclaim all things. Her triumph was not in escaping mortality, but in facing it unflinchingly. To live magnificently, knowing the end is certain, that was her true philosophy. And this is why her hidden legacy endures. It is not the palaces she built, the alliances she forged, or the treasures she possessed that make her immortal. It is her understanding of life's fragility, and the courage to embrace it anyway. Through centuries of retelling, she has taught humanity the same lesson she once embodied on the banks of the Nile, that the pursuit of greatness is not the denial of mortality, but the acceptance of it. Every generation that rediscovers her is, in truth, rediscovering itself, its longing for meaning, its defiance of oblivion. Tonight, in the digital age where history is archived in pixels rather than papyrus, her story still commands attention. The algorithms of modernity cannot silence her. They amplify her instead. Each film, each book, each new archaeological discovery adds another thread to her tapestry. Her legacy, like light reflecting off the Nile at dusk, continues to shimmer, unbroken, untamed, and eternal. For Cleopatra was never just a queen of Egypt. She was, and remains, the queen of memory itself, ruling over that secret empire where the past and the present endlessly entwine. There are moments in history when the line between myth and memory blurs, when a figure transcends the boundaries of time and becomes an eternal presence in the human imagination. Cleopatra exists precisely in that space, a being not confined to her century or her tomb, but reborn endlessly through art, rumor, and revelation. Yet there is a deeper dimension to her story, one rarely explored, the metaphysical idea of Cleopatra. For beyond the queen of flesh and gold lies something more abstract, an archetype, an energy that reappears whenever civilizations reach their threshold of transformation. Her life, her death, her defiance. These were not merely historical events. They became symbols of the eternal struggle between fate and free will, chaos and control, the mortal and the divine. To understand this, we must step beyond the chronicles of Rome and Egypt, beyond the papyrus and stone, and look instead at the philosophical afterlife of her image. In the centuries after her fall, mystics, poets, and philosophers began to use Cleopatra as a cipher for profound truths. They saw in her story a universal parable, the fall of wisdom before brute force, the silencing of the feminine principle in a world dominated by empire. The Egyptian queen became a mythic shorthand for a cosmic event, the eclipse of balance. Egypt had long embodied the harmony of duality. Isis and Osiris, life and death, reason and magic. When Cleopatra's light was extinguished, it was as if that harmony dimmed from the world. Her death marked not only the end of a dynasty, but the end of an age of mystery, when knowledge and power were still sacred, and rulers understood the invisible laws of the cosmos. Some esoteric traditions even claimed that Cleopatra was the last initiate of the ancient Egyptian priesthood, the final guardian of a spiritual science that predated Greece and Rome. These legends, though impossible to verify, carried a symbolic truth. For she did embody the synthesis of the old world's wisdom and the new world's ambition. Her life bridged the sacred and the secular. She spoke the language of the philosophers and the language of the gods. And when she died, that bridge burned. The West inherited her image, but not her understanding. The mysteries of Egypt, the art of governing the soul as well as the state, faded into myth. Yet myths are living things. They do not die, they transform. And so Cleopatra's essence reappeared throughout history, each time taking on new meaning. During the Renaissance, alchemists invoked her as a symbol of transmutation, the idea that through suffering and knowledge, base matter could become gold, and the mortal could become divine. In Romanticism, she was the embodiment of passion's purity, the woman who dared to love absolutely, even when love led to destruction. In modernity, she has become the avatar of individuality itself, the refusal to be defined by the systems that seek to control her. This is her hidden immortality. She evolves with human consciousness. Every time humanity reaches for a new definition of freedom or truth, Cleopatra's shadow rises once again. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of her metaphysical legacy is how it parallels the evolution of the feminine archetype itself. For thousands of years, societies have oscillated between reverence and fear of the feminine principle, the power to create, to intuit, to heal, to transform. Cleopatra embodied that power in its most refined form. She ruled not merely with the sword, but with intellect, allure, and an almost mystical understanding of perception. Her influence on men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony was not only emotional, it was psychological, spiritual, and strategic. She understood how to reach the human soul, not just the political mind. In a world where power was measured by force, she wielded influence through connection. That is the essence of the archetypal feminine. Not domination, but magnetism. In many ways, the modern world's slow rediscovery of her truth mirrors its rediscovery of the balance she represented. The rise of women in leadership, the merging of science and spirituality, the recognition that intellect and empathy can coexist, these are echoes of the age she symbolized. In her lifetime, Cleopatra's Egypt was a place where astronomers and poets, mathematicians and mystics, worked side by side. She ruled over a civilization that saw no contradiction between logic and myth. The world that replaced it, Rome's world, chose division over unity, hierarchy over harmony. And we still live in the long shadow of that choice. But as humanity once again searches for balance between progress and purpose, reason and reverence, Cleopatra's story resurfaces as a guidepost, a memory of what once was and what might be again. Modern scholars, while skeptical of mystical interpretations, cannot deny the strange persistence of her presence. Her name has become shorthand for the eternal feminine, invoked not only in history books but in psychology, art, and even popular culture. Jungian analysts have written of Cleopatra as an archetype of the sovereign lover, the part of the psyche that unites desire with wisdom, chaos with clarity. She is not just a historical personage. She is a symbol encoded in the collective unconscious. And that explains her immortality better than any tomb or treasure ever could. We carry her within us, as the reminder that power without understanding destroys itself, and love without purpose consumes itself. Even in contemporary Egypt, where her actual resting place remains undiscovered, the mystery of Cleopatra continues to pulse beneath the sands. Archaeologists search for her tomb not merely out of curiosity, but out of longing for closure, for connection. Each stone unearthed feels like an invocation, an attempt to bring her presence into light once more. Yet perhaps the true resting place of Cleopatra is not in any chamber or crypt, but in the human imagination itself. She has transcended physical existence. Like the phoenix, another ancient Egyptian symbol of rebirth, her spirit rises each time she is remembered, retold, reinterpreted. And so, as the 21st century unfolds, a world of digital empires, virtual power, and illusions of permanence, Cleopatra's legend feels more relevant than ever. She teaches us that image and influence, though intangible, can outlast any monument. She understood that legacy was not about possession, but projection. The Roman Empire, for all its might, is dust. The Ptolemaic palaces are ruins. But her gaze, immortalized in sculpture and story, still meets ours across 2,000 years. She is both past and prophecy, history and horizon. Perhaps this is the final mystery of Cleopatra, that her true power was never in the wealth she commanded, nor in the men she loved, but in her ability to inhabit the imagination of humanity. She became an idea, and ideas, unlike empires, do not die. They evolve, they adapt, they hide in art and reemerge in consciousness. And so she endures not as the queen who fell, but as the queen who transformed falling itself into flight. If you listen closely, beneath the noise of history, you can still hear her, soft as the ripple of the Nile, fierce as the hiss of the asp. Her whisper is not one of sorrow, but of promise. That nothing truly beautiful ever vanishes, that every ending conceals a beginning. In her story, we glimpse our own, the eternal dance of rise and ruin, memory and myth. Cleopatra's body may have returned to dust, but her soul, woven into the world's imagination, has become the very essence of immortality. In the vast theater of history, few figures have defied time as completely as Cleopatra. Her presence lingers like perfume on the wind, faint yet unmistakable, centuries after her kingdom was swallowed by empire. But beyond the ruins and retellings, there lies a question that refuses to fade. What does Cleopatra's legacy truly reveal about us? Perhaps it is not she who is being remembered, but we who are doing the remembering, projecting our desires, our fears, our understanding of power onto the surface of her legend. Every age remakes her in its own image, as if she were a mirror held up to civilization itself. Her story reminds us that influence is not measured in monuments or armies, but in resonance, the ability of one life to ripple endlessly across generations. Cleopatra's brilliance was not simply in how she ruled, but in how she embodied an idea. She understood that power is not the act of domination, but the art of meaning. She shaped her world through intellect and illusion, through empathy and strategy. Her true empire was perception itself. 2,000 years later, in a world still ruled by image, that lesson feels prophetic. And yet, for all her mastery, Cleopatra remains profoundly human. Her life was threaded with triumph and tragedy, courage and grief. She loved recklessly, fought relentlessly, and faced death with unwavering grace. Her story endures because it is not only about power, it is about the fragile, beautiful struggle to live with purpose in the face of impermanence. She reminds us that mortality is not the enemy of greatness. It is its maker. Standing at the edge of her story, one feels the strange pull of destiny, the sense that Cleopatra did not simply belong to her time, but to all time. She is a symbol of transformation, of the eternal cycle of creation and decay. Empires rise and fall, but the human spirit, embodied in figures like hers, continues to search for meaning, love, and truth. And perhaps that is her final gift, to teach us that influence need not fade when the body does, that even after death, the soul can leave light in its wake. In the quiet between past and present, where memory and myth intertwine, Cleopatra waits, not as a queen draped in gold, but as an idea still unfolding. She is the echo that reminds us that every legacy is, in truth, a reflection of the human heart, its hunger for beauty, its defiance of oblivion, and its unyielding belief that even in the face of ruin, something eternal endures. In the fading light of history, Cleopatra's story becomes more than memory. It becomes reflection. Her life, her power, her vanishing, all mirror our own yearning to be remembered, to shape destiny beyond the grave. She reminds us that legacy is not found in monuments, but in the ideas and emotions that survive us. The sands of Egypt shift endlessly, but her name endures, whispered through centuries as both warning and wonder. Perhaps her greatest secret was this: immortality is not granted by gods or tombs. It's carved in the hearts of those who refuse to let your story die. In the fading light of history, Cleopatra stands not as a relic, but as a reflection of power, of loss, of the eternal human hunger for meaning. Her face, once carved into coins and marble, now lives in our imagination, unbound by empire or time. The sands that hide her tomb cannot bury her influence. It flows through art, politics, and every story of resistance ever told. She teaches us that legacy is not what survives in stone, but what endures in spirit. The Romans built monuments. She built mystery. And mystery, unlike marble, does not crumble. As we trace her shadow through centuries of myth and memory, we find not the end of a queen's story, but the continuation of our own. For in seeking Cleopatra, we are always, in some way, seeking ourselves, our courage, our contradictions, our longing to be remembered not for how we died, but for how fiercely we lived. And so, as the sands of Egypt shift endlessly beneath the sun, Cleopatra endures, not as a figure trapped in the past, but as an eternal question. Her face may remain hidden, her tomb undiscovered, yet her presence lives within every pursuit of truth, every rebellion against silence. She reminds us that power can be graceful, that memory is stronger than marble, and that some stories are not meant to end, they are meant to echo. Perhaps that is her final gift, to show that immortality is not found in stone, but in the hearts that still seek her. The desert settles into silence once more. The wind traces the outlines of vanished walls, whispering through the ruins of palaces long consumed by sand and sea. Somewhere beneath that eternal horizon, Cleopatra's name still hums, a vibration felt more than heard. Her story does not end here. It never has. It lingers in the space between what we know and what we imagine. Every time a historian picks up a fragment of pottery, every time a poet writes her name, she rises again from the dust. That is her final act of sovereignty. To remain alive through memory, to rule through wonder. Perhaps this is what she intended all along. For Cleopatra understood that immortality was not granted by the gods. It was crafted by story. Her monuments would crumble, her enemies would rewrite her, but the myth she shaped was indestructible. She became the eternal queen, not because of conquest, but because she learned to wield the oldest power of all, the power of narrative. In that way, she lives not only in Egypt's sands but within the imagination of every soul who refuses to let time erase meaning. And maybe that is the lesson hidden within her legend. The world will always try to reduce greatness to fragments, to simplify the complex, to silence the defiant. Yet, like Cleopatra, truth persists in whispers and reflections, refusing to die. She teaches us that legacy is not about how long one reigns, but how deeply one resonates. The body fades, the empire falls, but the idea endures. So as the sun sets over the Nile, its light turning the river to molten gold, we are left with her reflection shimmering in the water. A symbol, a question, a presence. Not gone, not forgotten. Just waiting, as she always has, for those who dare to look deeper.